I don't care if people heard this part of it. I released. I've done a lot of back and forths, and I've interviewed some people, talked about meta ethics a few times, but I'd never actually written about it myself. And I think I left this in a comment under one of your last notes. You just put that link to the is it a paper that you had submitted?
Yep.
Um, in my article I released Saturday, um, I had actually one of the points I'd made had to do with the whole like meta ethical indeterminism thing, and I had linked your dissertation. Would Do you think that's fine for in terms of people looking at that, or do you think the paper that you just linked, would that be better if I went in there and linked to that instead?
No, the dissertation makes more sense. So the
Okay.
dissertation makes a more comprehensive case. I mean, there's kind of two main arguments there. The first argument is that all the existing ways of trying to figure out what people think about realism and anti-realism don't really work. So
Mhm.
the technical way to put it would be that the existing paradigms for assessing whether or not non-philosophers are moral realists or anti-realists systematically rely on measurement tools that have poor construct validity, something like that. Basically,
Mhm.
it's like if you wanted to measure the temperature, but you haven't invented the thermometer yet, and every attempt so
Mhm.
far might look like it works, but on closer examination, it really doesn't. So that's one thesis
Mhm.
there. And then the other thesis is that the reason why, it's a kind of abductive argument, the best explanation for why we haven't been able to devise a valid measure is because there isn't something to measure, right? So,
Mhm.
you couldn't, if you wanted to measure the amount of phlogiston, you wouldn't be able to do it because there isn't such a thing. So all the
Mhm.
attempts would keep failing, failing, failing. But here's one explanation: the thing you're trying to measure does not exist. And so what I
Mhm.
argue is not because like the researchers doing this are careful, they're thoughtful, they're great researchers. Like I'm super critical of the research, but I'm critical of it because I like it. Kind of the way you
Mhm.
creditize your kids because you love them, you want them to be
Mhm.
better.
Yeah.
That actually makes that sound more patronizing than I intended. Um, so a lot of the researchers, a lot of the researchers are more technically skilled at doing research than I am. I'm just, I guess, I'm a bit like Liam Neeson and take in that like Taken movies. Like I have a particular set of skills, and one of them is spotting problems with validity and measurement. And so that's what I argue there. The latest paper is actually heavily influenced by a section in the supplemental materials of the dissertation, where people could
Okay.
see a kind of preview of what ended up being in the publication that just came out. That publication makes a pretty straightforward argument. One of the efforts in trying to address the validity problem with all these measures and meta ethics. So other people, Thomas Polzer, Jennifer Wright, and some others are like, look, there are these measurement issues. Here's one way to circumvent them. We could just train the participants to understand the relevant meta ethical concepts,
Mm.
then ask them the questions. And what I argue is that there's no way for this to work because the whole point of the research is to test the views of people that are not trained in philosophy. And so
Mm.
if you train them and it's successful, they're not non-philosophers. If you train them and it's not successful, then you didn't succeed at the original task anyway, and you still have a validity issue. So it's lose lose. The only way it would work is if the clarification was so minimal that you could
Mhm.
get people to understand the concepts without plausibly them having to become philosophers. And so a big
Mm.
part of what I argue is once you take a closer look at what would be required to be confident that the people are interpreting the stimuli the way you intended, basically, you give them questions, you give them instructions. The only way to be confident and to ensure that they actually are understanding everything appropriately and responding appropriately would basically require a course in philosophy. It's not going to work by just giving them a
Mm.
paragraph and expecting that to work. The comparison I always like to give it at this point, I give these talking points all the time. It's like if you can't just get untrained people to understand quantum mechanics and like the variations in the Copenhagen and many worlds and hidden
Mhm.
variable interpretations of quantum mechanics by like having them read a few paragraphs or asking the question really carefully. No, you need to take courses in mathematics and work your way up. It's you need to be trained. And I think it's more or less the same thing with meta ethics. And I know a lot of philosophers might balk at that because they might think that the concepts are part of the ordinary thinking. They haven't proven that, or that they're relatively easy to grasp. I don't think they are. So
Mm. Yeah, I even wondered that's interesting because you had just I think it was yesterday you released sort of the first version with sort of the back and forth between the two different people about truth, and then the second version you sort of were more specific. And something to that effect actually came to my mind, because you were talking about how, I believe in the second sort of layout that you did of it, you were like, okay, well, this guy's saying, I've sort of through contemplation essentially determined that most people are using a correspondence theory of truth. Um, and it immediately struck me because I'd seen some of what you've talked about with the meta ethical indeterminism thing, where I was like, um, I wonder I wonder how reliable even responses would be, even if you did something like take a, be like, okay, well, we're going to get to the bottom of this. Take a group of people and be like, okay, here's correspondence theory, here's deflationary, here's, pragmatic, which of these do you do? Like, even if the people have, like, from that, they sort of have one that they lean towards. Like, I feel like I would still have doubt that them just sort of saying, "Oh, I think I do. I think I like correspondence." That is actually going to really like be representative of how they actually think and use the term in their day to day life. Especially if they've not really, if they've just like you said, if they've just sort of showed up for a study and it's like, well, here's these three, pick one. I don't, I would be. It's one of those things where like whatever conclusions where you could derive from that, I would be maybe you could kind of do something with it, but I would be really nervous about extrapolating broadly from that at all.
Yeah, so would I. So one method you could use for trying to figure out what people's view is in an experimental philosophy context is to sort of give them a menu of the philosophical positions on offer, and then say which one of these best matches what you endorse or what you take yourself to be doing, something like that. Uh, Experimental philosophers actually don't typically use that method, and people I think rightly are a little like, I'm not so sure if you give like lay people or untrained people that menu that they're going to know what the heck they're doing. And there's another issue here. I think it's a Marty. I don't know exactly how to pronounce her name, but they've given some critiques of some of the studies where they talk about what are called metalinguistic intuitions. So it turns out you could go around speaking and using language, and someone could say, okay, well, why do you use that term in that context, or what do you mean by that? And even if a person's a competent user of a term, or they're competent at like grammaticality judgments in their language, like if you give people a set of questions a set of sentences in English, and they're a native English speaker, and say, is this grammatical? Is this grammatical? They could go yes, no, yes, no, no, yes, no, no, very easily. And then if you say why, just watch people start going, oh shit, like I don't know, I'm not sure why. And if people did propose explanations, they're going to frequently get them wrong, and those would be their metalinguistic intuitions, their intuitions about what they take themselves to be doing in the language. And people can actually just be wrong about that, and they're actually often not very good at that. And it'd be the same thing in this case. How people use language, like truth talk, and how they think about truth, is not something that's so readily introspectively available to an untrained person. And so just asking them, do you use it in a truth correspondence sense, or a coherent sense, or deflationary or pragmatic sense? They're not going to know. And I doubt they would be able to readily make a good judgment about that, even if you explain the views to them. I think it would require a certain type of training. There's an excellent, excellent, excellent paper on this all the way back from 2007. The author, again, I'm not going to know how to pronounce any of these names. Antti-Kauppinen. It's a paper called The Rise and Fall of Experimental Philosophy. And he kind of stresses this point there. He's like, look, if you're asking people to make these sorts of judgments that don't have training, well, philosophers, when they are eliciting their own intuitions or reporting their own intuitions, they're doing so under the presumption that certain sorts of factors are being controlled for. So they're going, he takes them to be like, if they want a semantic judgment, then people need to be competent at holding pragmatic considerations in abeyance. They're going to need to like be insensitive to certain kinds of biasing factors. They're going to need to be competent under a range of counterfactual conditions that they're trained or allegedly trained. It's not like philosophers say they're trained to do this, but like it's not like it's boot camp and you go there and they're like, think without pragmatic influence. Like I don't actually think they're trained to do this, but they at least purport to be. And so what he argues is the kinds of intuitions experimental philosophers are trying to elicit, people are not understanding that they're even in a context where those are the conditions they're supposed to meet, and they're not good at it anyway. So
Mhm.
So they're not going to be able to give those sorts of answers. Anyway, the point I'm driving at here, though, is that experimental philosophers frequently use indirect methods. So in meta ethics, it's very rare for a researcher to just ask people, do you think morality is objective or not? The main method they ask people is to ask them to consider a disagreement between two people and then judge whether
Mhm.
they think both people could be correct or at least one of them is incorrect. And it's a partially indirect method. And in that case, that the idea would be if you use indirect methods where you're just trying to see how they apply concepts in some seemingly ordinary way, that's going to give you insight into their views rather than just
Mhm.
directly asking them.
Yeah, that definitely seems better because I mean, as I've run into when I've had conversations with, well, different types, but realists in particular, sometimes these words, especially like objective, stance independent, like, they get kind of thrown around, and sometimes you find out that people don't mean exactly, they might, and especially someone who's not into these things at all, when you say objective, if you just throw that out there and assume that they're all going to be kind of thinking of that word in the same way, that could lead to some really like squirrely sort of downstream results. All right, well, welcome everyone. um, yeah, we kind of ran off on a thing there, which is awesome. That's kind of one of my favorite things. But yeah, I'm Ishmael Hodges, right here on Substack about a variety of things, philosophy, religious deconstruction. I do some poetry. I make people suffer my poetry sometimes. But I'm super excited today. I'm joined by Dr. Lance Bush. Um, I'll kick it over to him in just a second to sort of introduce himself, so that I don't make a dog's bollocks of it, as the Brits say. Um, but I think I'm very excited today. I think a lot of people maybe that are here, definitely from his side of the fence. I think it's safe to say Lance is maybe primarily known for his work in meta ethics, some of which we were just talking about there a minute ago. But here of late, Lance has been sort of pushing on this idea of philosophical intuitions, and in interacting with him here on Substack, um, well, first of all, I just find the idea very interesting, but I realized that just sort of the concept of intuitions, period, I'd never really pressed on for myself before, and so I'm very excited to sort of dive into that in a deeper way with him. So, Dr. Bush, if you would like to introduce yourself and just kind of give a basic rundown.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so I'm Lance. So I work in philosophy and psychology. I have a background in both. I did my master's in philosophy, my PhD in psychology. But my PhD in psychology, I did interdisciplinary work. So earlier I was talking about my dissertation. My dissertation is in an area I call it experimental meta ethics, but that's really just a subcategory of experimental philosophy. And so what experimental philosophy is this movement that arose right at the turn of the century, where a handful of philosophers started thinking, hey, a lot of philosophers are saying this is intuitive, that's intuitive, this is the common sense view, that's the common sense view. But they've rarely, if ever, gone out and tested many of the claims that they make. And so they started doing that. They started testing, well, does the folk concept, they use the term folk, I prefer the term non-philosopher. I think it's more descriptive and clear what I'm referring to. It's people without a bunch of training in philosophy. Does the folk concept of knowledge correspond to how philosophers typically use the term? And then this sort of just exploded into research on consciousness and free will and a whole bunch of stuff. So my interest in this came from a pre-existing interest in philosophy and psychology that gradually converged and coalesced into a distinctive interest in metaethics, which is this abstract area of ethics that deals with fundamental questions about the nature of morality. And I got really interested in the methods used to try to figure out how non-philosophers think. I think that it's a sort of underexplored area. And that's what I ended up writing my dissertation on, is the methods that experimental philosophers try to use in that specific domain. And what I did is a kind of systematic evaluation, both theoretically and empirically, of all the research that's been done there. So that's what I do. I teach psychology courses. I've taught philosophy courses in the past a little bit too. And so my research is primarily on metaethics, but I do a little bit on free will. And some of my interest now is shifting towards intuitions, or the sort of the primary tool that philosophers allegedly use. I should say, though, it is something that goes way back to when I was in graduate school. They didn't have a course on philosophical methods or intuitions and ended up creating an independent study that a professor agreed to teach, where I got to create the syllabus, and it was called I think it was Intuitions and Philosophical Methods. So I took a course on it that I made for myself, which is a lot of fun. Independent studies are cool. You should do them if you get a chance. But yeah, so I think that's what the focus today is going to be on, is this notion of philosophical intuitions.
Very cool. Do you want to just sort of quickly lay out, because I know obviously, here, well, obviously you've got a history of it, but as well, it seems here of late, you've been really sort of trying to push back on the idea and push on the idea. Do you want to sort of quickly lay out how you see the term being used, maybe where you think the issues are, and if you find it necessary, maybe to, or maybe you won't, but I think maybe you will, sort of draw a distinction between these like philosophical intuitions specifically that people that people in these spaces tend to refer to, as opposed to, as you said, non-philosophical intuitions, or however, hunches, or whatever else you want to say. I'm getting mauled by my cat, so just
Yeah, sure. So yeah, the first thing to say is that I am not skeptical of or opposed to any and all conceptions of intuition. So first, it's important to draw a distinction between the word intuition and then whatever phenomena it may or may not be used to refer to by any particular person in any particular context. And so, one thing to note about the term intuition is that it's an ordinary language term as well. If it is a technical term, there's also an ordinary language analog, unlike something like mitochondria or I don't know, boson or something like that, where that's not a part of everyday language.
Mhm.
Those terms were specifically proposed and devised in scientific contexts to do explanatory work within a particular discourse. They weren't like an existing feature of the way everybody already spoke. Intuition isn't like that. Intuition already existed as a part of ordinary language, at least in English. I don't know what the cognate terms would be in the many other languages in the world, but there's probably pretty close analogs all around the world in with regards to how the term is ordinarily used. So how is the term ordinarily used? Well, I take that to be an empirical question. It's a question we need to go out and do a bunch of work, but very roughly, people frequently appear to me, this is relying on anecdotes and my own personal judgments, not some study I've conducted. They used to refer to hunches, a sort of sense that something is true, an inclination to believe something without necessarily giving one's assent to or ultimately believing it. In other words, you could have an intuition that something's the case, but not end up not believing it. It could be used to refer to like heuristics. There's all sorts of ways a person might use it. Sometimes it's even used in an almost paranormal sense, like, oh, I had an intuition, and people almost use it similar, like clairvoyance or precognition or something like that. So it has a wide variety of uses in ordinary language. Sometimes it's loaded up with seemingly mystical or paranormal qualities. Sometimes it's treated as relatively mundane. But it's just like any other folk psychological term, where its application is not going to be amenable to any sort of like rigid conceptual analysis. No one's going to be able to say the term intuition, as it is used in ordinary language, has this specific meaning and no other. Like many, many terms, it's polysemous. It's going to be used, meaning it has multiple meanings. Its meaning is going to shade and grade into variations in different connotations. And one thing to note about polysemy is that when a term has multiple meanings, this does not mean there's like a list of discrete meanings, discrete meaning 1, discrete meaning 2, discrete meaning 3. Rather, it could often be seen more as a continuum, where depending on tone, context, and constantly shifting characteristics and of how the term is being used in the context of how others are using it, and the situations you would use it in, and the changing landscape, like, with the rise of the internet and technology, some terms we initially didn't use in a internet related sense are now used in an internet related sense, right? So words are like this. They're constantly shading and varying in meaning, more like a color wheel than like discrete categorical distinctions. And so the reality is that the term is used in a way that would best comport with some sort of family resemblance account. And so it's not going to be subjectable to a certain kind of conceptual analysis that would allow for you to have this like single rigid meaning. Now, does that mean we can't do any analysis of the way the word is used in ordinary language? Of course not. We could go out and do that analysis, and we could get a pretty good idea. Just the same way, although there's a color wheel, the conclusion, would you conclude hey, well, because colors all shade into one another, therefore red doesn't exist, therefore purple doesn't exist. No, not at all. And it's the same with polysemous ordinary language terms. I'm not saying because the term can't be subjected to formal 20th century hopes of a perfect conceptual analysis, therefore we can't say anything about what ordinary language terms mean. That's stupid. That would be an overreach. I'm not saying that. What I am saying is that it's kind of, the reality is fuzzy, messy, and chaotic. Now, the way that philosophers use it may pick out one or another rough ways that it's used in ordinary language, perhaps with a little bit of refinement. And this is something that Bingson talks about. He talks about the term intuition not being a technical term where you have the ordinary language terms and then a technical term that's sort of autonomous and separate from them, but rather it's a discriminative term where you have all these ordinary language terms, and then it's like, here's the one we're using, that one right there. So it's picking out one. Now, I'm skeptical of that because I still think it's an empirical question whether or not he's actually picked out one of the uses. Because, I could say, hey, I'm in using this term, I'm not using it in a technical sense that it doesn't map on to any ordinary use. I'm using it in a discriminative one that maps onto one of the ordinary uses, like use number 7. Okay, well, it's still an empirical question whether there is a use number 7 that comports with your account. And I don't think that he's shown that. And I don't think that it would be successful because I think the way philosophers use the term is frequently quite weird. And I think Bingson falls into that category, but that's a separate question. Okay, so I'm saying a lot about ordinary language. The point here is that then in different sort of academic discourses, that same term has been, I just use the phrase like kidnapped. I mean, you could say co-opted, you could use something a little less flamboyant, but I like the flamboyant term kidnapped. Philosophers will frequently take ordinary language terms and kidnap them, meaning that they take some term that has established meanings and uses within ordinary language. They take that exact same term, they pull it outside of those contexts, and they use it in some novel situation or context that isn't a part of ordinary discourse. And philosophical, like academic philosophical work, is certainly not part of ordinary discourse. And I think the problem with this is that I think that the meaning of ordinary language terms is at least partially determined by the way that they're used in that particular discourse. The same way, take a chess piece, the way a bishop moves. Bishops move diagonally. They don't move in straight lines. They can move as far as they can as long as they're not obstructed by another piece. You can't pass through your own pieces. You can, all the rules that govern bishop movement, right? And then, of course, knights and rooks and pawns all move differently. Now, imagine taking the piece, a bishop, and saying, no, we're going to take a bishop outside the game of chess and use it in another context. What? Well, whatever you're doing, you're not using it in the way that it's used in the context of the game. The function of a bishop only makes sense, that specific function, in light of the rest of the game. If you're using it in some different even if it's a game similar to chess, it could be, Dennett's, Schmess, like some game slightly like chess, but you like remove one pawn or whatever. Then it's no longer, it doesn't have the same characteristics. In that case, it would have pretty similar characteristics. But the problem is that philosophers take terms that have ordinary language uses, they pull them outside of that use, they redeploy them in a new context, and then insist, even stipulate, that they're using them in the exact same way that they're used in their ordinary contexts. I don't think that's how language works. So I don't think that this makes any sense. Like on principle, I don't think it makes sense. Well, maybe not in principle, maybe in practice it makes sense, but I don't think that this makes sense. Anyway, so I've said a lot there, but I just want to say now, when you get over to philosophy, and then I'll pause right after saying this, the way that they end up using the term intuition runs the gamut from the most conventional, mundane, and ordinary ways you could possibly use the term. So they really are saying, look, I'm using it to mean hunch. I'm using it to mean a disposition to believe. I'm using it to mean believe. I'm just using the term intuition because that's what we do in philosophy. And it's just isomorphic with, or maps on to, completely mundane, unobjectionable terms that we already accept, or at least I accept, that I wouldn't complain about. So that's on one end of the spectrum where it's really mundane and unobjectionable. Then you go all the way to the other end of the spectrum where philosophers will insist that we have a special faculty, a special mental faculty, like we have seeing, we have hearing, and then we have the faculty of intuition. It's a specific faculty that's separate from all the other mental faculties we have, and it specifically operates on or produces or is receptive to, or however it's supposed to work, intuitions. And intuitions are sui generis. They can't be reduced to, cashed out, or explained in any other terms other than they are intuitions. They're not anything else. They are intuitions. And these intuitions have a distinct phenomenology. So there's taste, there's hearing, and then there's having intuitions. There's intellectual seemings or appearances. And just like you have
Mm,
visual perception and auditory perception, just like you could see and you could hear, you also have philosophical or intellectual seemings. It's almost a quasi perceptual or sensorial in the way that it's described. And that's on the far end. And that is the thing that I'm skeptical of. If they want to claim that we have a special mental faculty, well, they're talking about psychology. And the issue is
mm,
that there, I don't know of any research in the cognitive sciences that suggests that we have this extra special faculty for like detecting a priori truths. There, like there's no neuroscience supporting this. There's no cognitive science supporting this, and so they're making these really, really bold, what strike me as empirical hypotheses. And then you go pop open a paper by Beeler or the way Humer talks about it. I,
mm.
I don't know what because like some of the things they say, it's not this isn't an empirical question. It's a philosophical question. It's autonomous from the sciences. What? I mean, if you're talking about a psychological faculty, how the hell could its existence and functioning be autonomous from the sciences? You're talking about psychology. Like I mean, maybe they think it's. I don't even want to speculate. But that should give the landscape of what I'm talking about. So I'll stop there.
Yeah. No, no, absolutely. Um, it seems like because you mentioned humor, it almost seems like, and I'm not saying that all the people that use it in this very sort of strong, specific way that you're describing, maybe they all aren't something like a phenomenal conservatist, if that would be the right way to say that. But like, it seems that you would almost need to have some sort of background, either like epistemology or it doesn't matter. I don't remember the guy's name, but it was somebody else you were responding to who seemed to be using it in that way. But for him, it was like it seemed like he was coming from this like meditation angle where he's like, well, I meditate, and so therefore I have like direct access to sort of like internal objective truths or something to this effect. Um, and I think that's like, to me, that's the big issue, is that even within the philosophical sort of dialogue, it's like a separate type of, maybe it's not truly separate, but like a separate type of polysemy. Because like I use it's tough because I have philosophical conversations all the time, and I'm not like a classically, not even classic, I'm not a formally educated person of philosophy at all. um so oftentimes I'll have conversations that are about philosophy, but they are very sort of more mundane, sort of conversational sorts of discussions. And so if I use the word intuition, like, typically all I'm saying is it's just a bit of self-report, Like, I don't expect the other person to find that compelling. I don't expect them to do anything with that. It's just sort of me being like, man, maybe if I'm like disagreeing with what they're saying, I might be like, man, that doesn't feel right to me. But that's just an expression. And then for me, from there, I would then take it on to go like, okay, why? Why is it that doesn't feel right? Is it some nonsense that I believe, that, you know what I mean? I then want to press on that intuition, and I want to try to understand why it is that I'm having a reaction to something without understanding why I'm having that reaction. Like, to me, it promotes a question. And from my very lay approach to these conversations, what is really killing me is it's one thing to give self-report. um and I've had some great conversations. It's not like, I'm not trying to paint with too broad of a brush, like for the meta ethics discussions that say, oh, all moral realists do this. They don't. But I've seen a lot of moral realists make these really broad sweeping claims about how, like, oh, well, most people have this intuition, or most people have that intuition, or even some of the studies you've shown where there's this really big disconnect where, like, it's very, very confusing to me. Because I think there was the one study you posted that was talking about the people who were sharing it were trying to say that it showed that essentially that, like, children are
Yeah.
like moral realist. The study didn't really show that, first of all. But my response to that even was, I was like, even if it did, why do what? Like, I don't I don't care. Like, just because an intuition is held widely, that has no bearing on whether or not it's true. And so to not only have sort of baseless and unfounded the references to the intuitions of others that you're just assuming that other people share your own intuitions. And that's the thing too. It's pretty much always them saying, "Oh, everybody," you know what I mean? They're not saying, "Oh, here's my intuition, but everyone else has a different intuition." It's almost always them sort of supporting the validity of their own intuition by saying, "Oh, well, everybody knows this," or "Oh, everybody thinks this way, and if you don't think that way, then there must be something wrong with you." Or like you said in your recent the one you just released, the giraffe maxing in the semantic punt article, where it's like, well, we can sort of presume that this is the case, and if you don't get it, then there's any number of these things that must be wrong with you. You're either lying, or you're confused, or your brain is broken, or you know, some sort of shot essentially. Um, and I think, but for me, I think that and I'm curious your thoughts on that. It's like, it's not even just that it's unfounded to claim that other people have particular intuitions. To me, that's not even like that's annoying from the standpoint like of making an unverified claim. But to me, I don't even really think that that has much to do with the conversation. Like throughout human history, whether you want to call it intuitions or common sense or however you want to term these things. I mean, I think this is a lot of the root with my issues with the phenomenal conservatism thing. Is like I'm very leery based for me on my reasoning, my own personal life experience, and also looking at history of sort of defaulting to having a trust of our own seemings, intuitions, whatever you want to say, because throughout history we've shown time and time and time and time and time and time and time again that what was just common sense and common knowledge and everybody knows this turns out to be fucking wrong. So like how do you see that in terms of like do you think that even if they did establish, I guess is my question to be more specific, even if they were to establish the presence of, oh well, look, we did this study and they got past all the issues that you were talking about in the beginning of the conversation of the actual practical issues of even conducting such a study well, that would get at a sort of like an actionable result that would allow you to draw any sort of strong conclusions. um do you think that even if you could show empirically that, oh, most people have X intuition, do you think that even then still buys anything in terms of a real argument?
I think it gets you a little bit. It
Okay.
does, because take imagine that there's one person that reports some sort of extrasensory capacity, like they could detect something in space that the rest of us can't see, or they
Hmm.
could detect a new type of electromagnetic radiation that the rest of us can't see. Uh, I don't think that we would take that person very seriously unless we had independent means of corroborating their claims. Like they make
Hmm.
predictions, we go test them, we can confirm the prediction. Fine. Then maybe that one person has a special power. As the number of people increase that seem to have a particular shared experience, that all else being equal is at least some indication
Hmm.
that whatever it is that they purport to be experiencing is more likely to be real. It's not particularly dispositive though, because if you look at surveys, and there's these surveys are done all the time, Gallup and Pew and that sort of thing, millions and millions and millions of people believe in precognition, they believe in telepathy, they believe in
Hmm.
clairvoyance, they believe in astral projection, they believe in astrology. People to this very day, and it would have been much more popular in the past, have a wide range of superstitious and paranormal beliefs that don't withstand empirical scrutiny for 5 minutes. Much less is there any viable mechanism by which people, like, there's no apparatus in the brain that could plausibly serve the telepathy lobe or something like that. Uh,
Hmm.
and yet people believe in that stuff anyway. So it's not going to get you that much, but it gets you a little bit. Uh,
Hmm.
if you're the one person claiming to see or understand or have a particular concept, if you stand alone, that is more consistent with the explanation that there's something wrong with you than if we're all like that. And so, if what
Hmm.
realists could show is that children from an early age is sort of pan cultural, cross cultural tendency, they in every culture that we test, they reliably operate under the presumption that moral realism is true until and only until they're dissuaded of that position.
Hmm.
That would be consistent with intuitionist proponents claiming that we have a special faculty that allows them to detect the truth. And it would have to be better. It have to be at least some evidence of it, because evidence against it is evidence against their view. So, if people like Humer and others claim, hey, most people have these intuitions, and this is evidence of the view. If I could show that most people don't have, like, again, they take that to be evidence of the view. So if you could undermine the empirical claim, then you could undermine the claim that relies on it. In other words, what frequently people will do is they'll say, look, I don't care if most people are realists. That still wouldn't be evidence of realism. But if it's not even true that they're realists, it's moot, because then their claim is undermined at a more fundamental level. So, if someone says everyone can see what I see, and that's evidence that I'm right, if I could point out, no, they don't see what you see. They're not reporting that. You're wrong about what they think. Look, did you go ask them? Because I asked them and they said, I don't see that. So now they can't leverage the fact that everybody sees the same thing as they do as evidence that the thing they see is real, because it's just false to begin with. And so it's perfectly fine to also say, and even if everybody thought this way, it still wouldn't be particularly good evidence. I don't think that it would be. But if you can undercut the empirical claim itself, it's like totally catastrophic to any claim that realists have that the proportion of people on their side somehow matters. The other thing I'll say is, rhetorically speaking, it might not seem to you like it matters very much, and maybe it shouldn't. Like I don't personally think it matters that much, but notice how realists leverage the presumption that their view is the common sense view. They routinely imply that, and this is both professional philosophers and non-philosophers, even professionals do this, that if you don't share those intuitions, you're a psychopath, you're evil, you're insane. These are all things I've been personally called in just the few years I've been doing this online, 4 or 5 years. I've had at least 5 or 6 instances of being called a psychopath, maybe more. Psychopathic, brain damaged, deranged, lying, disingenuous, bad faith, grifting, pretending, delusional, brain damaged, neurological problem. You probably have a brain tumor. Just on and on and on with the we are normal. There's something pathological about you if you don't see things the way that we do. If it turns out that they are the idiosyncratic ones, if they're less than 1% of the world's population, they have no business saying that any of that stuff. That all turns out to be bullshit. And yet they can say that in front of audiences, and audiences are receptive to that. They could say, look at this Lance Joker. Look at this asshole. This guy doesn't think it's that genocide is objectively wrong. He doesn't even think that. You can't trust this guy, to do anything. I mean, you don't know what he's going to do next. He might stab you. You shouldn't be friends with him. They will leverage that fact. And again, sometimes professionals do this. I mean, Jason Brennan is a professional philosopher, and I mean, he has the syllogism about how you're relativist or evil. I mean, it's ridiculous, and some of it comes off. Honestly, some of it comes off as unprofessional and childish from people with literal PhDs that are like, endowed chairs at top universities. I'm not saying it's like a random community college adjunct lecturer, which not that I don't think that would matter, because it's perfectly competent too. But even esteemed and prestigious people within academic philosophy will imply that people that lack certain kinds of intuitions, and this isn't just in metaethics, this is in consciousness, free will, a variety of other areas, they will imply that there's something seriously defective. I mean, I'll take consciousness as an example. It's just proponents of phenomenal consciousness, or this idea that we have qualia, they can't help but mock, ridicule, and express constant contempt for illusionists and eliminativists about consciousness. Oh, so you must be a pea zombie. Oh, so you don't even have experiences. Just childish behavior. Childish. It's childish behavior. And they can't help it. And these are, again, professionals. I mean, Galen Strawson says that illusionism and eliminativism are the great silliness. I mean, just the great silliness. It's literally like a term a child would come up with, like literally. I'm not even being hyperbolic here. It's embarrassing. It's embarrassing for a field of and then these people are invited to give the Oxford lecture, blah 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 blah. I'm so special, and I have a tie, and look at me, and I'm in a suit, and look how serious I am. And then they can't be bothered to even learn to accurately characterize the positions they're criticizing. Are you kidding me? And then those people are the ones taken seriously. And then they would say something like you or me, oh, they're just a blogger. I like my recent debate with David Enoch. one
Hmm.
of the comments was, "This is like a debate. This debate is Oxford professor versus a Discord moderator." That's what they referred to me as, a Discord moderator. Uh, which, never mind the fact that I actually have credentials, but notice another way that academic philosophers denigrate opposition and shield themselves and insulate themselves against objections is credentialism and ridicule. And
Hmm.
it's when the emperor has no clothes, this is the sort of thing that you would predict people would appeal to, rather than just pointing to the obvious fact that we have intuitions, if they actually had evidence of that. When the like flat earthers go around spouting their bullshit, what do their critics do on YouTube? They make 3-hour videos explaining here's the gratuitous, unnecessary amount of details and of evidence for why we know the Earth is round. To such a ridiculous extent, you would have to be completely ignorant or stupid to not understand this. You don't see. I bet there's not a single video like that on the internet for the existence of sui generis intuitions. Not one on the internet in any language anywhere in the world. I bet you there's not one. If someone finds it, please send it to me, and I'll admit that I was wrong. Instead, what you get is posturing, ridicule, and mockery. And that's what you would predict. I mean, if we want to be Bayesians about it, that's what you would predict if people were full of shit.
Hmm. Yeah, no, I'm definitely inclined to agree. I think that's why, like, I'm sure if somebody looked, you could find, me saying that something was obviously wrong, conversationally, it happens sometimes. But it's one thing if somebody says, like, oh, well, that's obviously wrong, and then goes on to sort of flesh out why that's the case to make an argument for it. But like the number of times I see really, whether it's here on Substack, like, really big philosophy authors, or as you said, people that are, you know, holding chairs and on podcasts and, people that should know better, where this appeal to obviousness, and then there's really nothing else. Like there's really nothing else there. And my thing is like, okay, if it's so obvious, you really shouldn't have much difficulty just kind of explaining it in simple language, then, should you? And then oftentimes there's just more bloviating, and then often once again, it's not all the time. I don't want to if we're talking about moral realism, I'm not going to mischaracterize all realists this way, but it is very bothersome to me the degree to which, as you said, there is this reflexive shot to some sort of an ad hominem or another. And then you brought up the illusionism thing. And to me, it's a very similar it's a very similar problem where um it often seems to me that they don't really understand the actual nature of the conversation, because the whole meta ethics versus normative ethics, applied ethics, like, I understand that these are all related topics. And so I do think in conversations about them, it is natural for things to kind of drift a little bit. And for me, at least, I always want to try to acknowledge if I'm having a meta ethical conversation, for instance, and then something sort of strikes a concern that sort of then leans more into like normative ethics. I'll usually try to acknowledge that I'm doing that, just to sort of signify that I know that what I'm talking about isn't like sort of a purely meta ethical thing. But to me, that's different than like so many times, particularly, and once again, maybe anti-realists do it as well in different ways, and I'm just not as clued into it because I am an anti-realist. Um, but there's so many times when um something that is just like a purely meta ethical statement, for instance, my friend, philosophical convictions Ed on here, who I actually got to meet in person the other day. He's amazing. Um, he's done a lot of work on emotivism, and one of the things I think emotivism is a really good example of this. And you're much more educated on these things, obviously, than I am. So if I misrepresent this at all, you can definitely correct me. But one of the things I like about emotivism, and oddly, in a similar way, I like it in theory of mind, I like about illusionism, is like I feel like they're very sort of pure in a way, because I feel like emotivism is very sort of honed in on like the function part from a meta-ethical perspective about like, okay, what is occurring when we make moral statements? Like what's sort of the actual mechanism? It doesn't it doesn't tend to get so much more into sort of like things like social structure and different things along like this. Um but even for emotivism, the amount of times that I see Ed getting just these like barbs and arrows slung in his direction, you know, to me it makes the best example because it's like you mentioned the one author who has been said the nasty stuff about relativism. With relativism, at least, like I don't agree with it because I think it similar to the illusionism thing. I think it shows that people don't understand what the relativist is actually saying. But I do understand in sort of a common language standpoint when if someone says morality is relative, especially if a person has a realist background, that sort of pings something in their head where they're like, oh God, you know, like I can kind of understand that. But if you have any understanding at all of what emotivism is actually saying, to then start like hurling insults or saying that that necessarily leads to all sorts of horrible downstream, like it seems to me genuinely that a lot of the people coming from that side of things genuinely do not understand, and this is a seeming, but it seems to me like they genuinely do not understand what meta ethics even is and what it's for.
You mean even professionals?
Um, I would say sometimes, yeah, because it doesn't like they. It seems like they are unable to hear any. Many realists seems like they are unable to even consider certain anti-realist positions without immediately just dragging the whole thing into normative ethics and
Yeah,
normative
that's
concerns.
certainly been my impression and my
Yeah.
experience of non-philosophers, like non-professionals, I guess I should say, and at least some professionals. Yeah, the other weird stuff that you know you get objections again from professional philosophers that are so bad. You have to wonder where are they getting this from? So okay, here's a standard one against moral relativism. People will say the problem with moral relativism is that it's impossible to account for progress. Okay, well, what kind of progress are you talking about? Are you talking about progress with respect to a stance independent standard? And are you defining relativism as the view that all moral truths are relative and specifically that they're stance dependent? Well, then you're saying, hey, a view according to which there are no stance independent moral truths because you can make progress on stance independent moral truths. So that view is wrong. What did they go to question begging university? Like what kind of nonsense is that? That's a ridiculous objection. I mean, a lot of these objections are kind of like they're as ridiculous as this. If atheism is true, God wouldn't exist, but God exists, so atheism isn't true. Valid argument? Sure, it's a modus tollens. But you could do that. It's a perfectly valid argument. It's a vacuous argument. And so if your objection to atheism is, but they deny God exists, almost every one of these sort of intuition pump type arguments that realists employ against anti-realist views is some variation of a direct appeal to a realist intuition. And so what kind of my problem with it, so apparently the problem with anti-realism is that it's not realism. What the heck is that? But you see this again from professionals. I saw one today where, again, a professional philosopher said, if moral relativism is true, it'd be impossible for people to be wrong about their what's morally right or wrong, and that's supposed to be outrageous and implausible. The problem is that if you unpack what they're saying something like this: conditional on the view that moral truths reflect one's own standards, people would be incapable of being wrong because people are incapable of being wrong about what their standards are. But if you yourself think people are incapable of being wrong about what their standards are, then you agree that relativists are infallible, at least with respect to reporting what their preferences are. You just don't agree that their preferences are constitutive of morality because you reject relativism. So what kind of objection is that? The objection is the problem with relativism is that it's relativism. That's really the only way that objection could work in any respect at all, because the alternative would be for the relativists to just say, I don't think we're infallible about what our standards or the standards of our culture are. And then the accusation doesn't even work because then they wouldn't even say that they're infallible. So it's lose-lose for the critic. Either the argument is presumptuous and just question beggingly presumes that relativism is false, or it pitches the relativist to false claim. Notice, by the way, that criticism is that the critic says relativists think moral truths are relative to standards of culture, and at the same time they'll say also it turns out that we are infallible with respect to what our own values or the values of our culture are. That's not a part of relativism. A relativist isn't required to think that. A relativist could say, I don't think we're infallible. And so now the criticism doesn't apply. So it can't serve as an internal critique of relativism because it's not part of relativism. And if it's an external critique, then it would rely on the critic assuming that we're infallible with respect to what our own values are, in which case, what the hell is their objection to that? What's so implausible about it? They're the one advocating it. So how are they saying it's implausible? I mean, this objection, the critic just hasn't thought it through. It's what it does is what critics are ultimately doing is they're relying on the audience to psychologically equivocate between two senses of infallibility. The relativist would at best only be committed to saying, look, as a subjectivist, you know what your own preferences are, and you can't be wrong about those. Now, if you told that to people, they might go, yeah, okay, I agree with that. Then if you say, okay, and then they're also saying maybe analytically, that's just what moral claims are. They're just expressions of what the subjective truths are. Okay, now if they object to that, then they're just objecting to subjectivism. Fine. But in that case, your objection to subjectivism is I reject subjectivism. It's unintuitive or something. That's not a substantive objection to it. So if they accept the first claim, there shouldn't be any issue with the subjectivist being infallible because they're infallible about something that the critic themselves grants people are infallible about. No big deal. So what the critic trying to use this will try to do is appeal to the fact that people supposedly are not relativists. And so then they try to imply that the relativist is saying we're infallible about non-relativist moral truths, which obviously we couldn't be. So then relativism is supposed to be wrong. So the only way it works is by confusing audiences and conflating the sense in which you think things are people are infallible. So the argument just it doesn't work, and it relies on a kind of rhetorical strategy of prompting audiences to conflate meanings of a term. You're sort of inducing equivocation in your audience and then banking on that being rhetorically effective. If that's not a shitty way to argue, I don't know what is. I mean, that's a textbook definition of sophistry, and this is like a kind of objection that you would literally see in like a textbook for ethics. So, what? Who's approving this crap? And by the way, as a last note about that, I have been contacted and consulted on people that teach ethics courses where they're given a previous lecturer's notes or they're using a particular book or resource, and those books or resources or lecture notes just absolutely strawman the hell out of and mischaracterize relativism, emotivism, error theory, just riddled with falsehoods, mischaracterizations, and at best, lazy, uncharitable objections where they'll present the crudest version of an anti-realist view, like just A.J. Ayer in the crudest, most dumbed-down form, then the most standard response to that, and then no follow-up. So nothing Ayer himself would have said 40 years later. Ayer himself revised, refined, and modified his views over time. Just like John Stuart Mill, just like many other proponents of meta-ethical views and other philosophical views, they refined, revised, and improved those views in light of objections and criticisms. But the standard textbook objection only focuses on like version 1.0 and gives response 1.0, and then doesn't explore any of the dialectic of the century of responses that followed. Good luck trying to show that contemporary expressivism falls victim to the kinds of objections people raise to emotivism. It doesn't. And you rarely see critics spend almost any time at all on that in the public discourse. It's always shot below the belt, always.
Yeah. And there's this really like reflexive dismissiveness. And in the piece I just wrote, I tried to flip it a little bit, because the thing in my conversations that I've run into is what you're saying, which is this thing where the realist presumes the correctness of their own view, which I understand that obviously if someone holds a view, they think it's correct. But for the sake of actual conversation, like, once again, the whole concept of, good faith and stuff, you're supposed to try to understand the other person's view, like by its own lights, essentially. But But the other thing that strikes me over and over and over again is that it doesn't really seem to matter which anti-realist view they're interacting with, because they feel, and this is my take on it, because they feel like um their morality is grounded in this rock solid stance independent, objective, whichever term they choose to use, because they feel it's grounded in this rock solid thing. They have this tendency to treat all the other alternatives as being just essentially just whimsy. And when they hear relativism, it like it, it's often like the instant the instant understanding of the idea of relativism is that, oh, well, this just means just everyone just does any idiosyncratic whatever the hell they want. Which, once again, I don't know every relativist. I'm not saying that maybe there aren't relativists who act like that, but to act like that necessarily falls out of relativism is ridiculous, because, like, relative means doesn't mean relative to whatever whimsy fart, whatever, you know what I mean? Like, that's not what it means. It means relative to, like, local, either it can mean a bunch of things, relative to local standards, cultural standards. Like, it's going to depend partly on the person. But my thing, and I don't have a particular sort of position within anti-realism that I like kind of fully adopt. Um, but my thing is, I feel like I could quite easily make a similar. I don't, because I think it would be uncharitable, but I could make very easily a similar counter argument where it's like, I always get this thing when I talk to realists where they're like, "Oh, well, where do you ground? The grounding idea." It's like, well, where do you ground your thing? And then when the concept of like a psychopath comes up, they're like, "Well, how can you possibly tell him that he shouldn't do this or that?" And the way they use "should" I also find strange. But anyway, um, I'm like, you're asking me where we can ground these things, and I'm like, I can literally give you a whole host of options, most of which I think are very, very compelling things as human beings. Like, my own personal history. For certain people, it'll be something like personal trauma. Like, it is going to change for different people. But history of the world, cultural history, biology, like, there are all different sort of like very compelling things about us as human beings that, for me, I think it's quite simple to find ways in which to ground. It's like, oh, well, how can you tell someone else that they shouldn't, kill another person? It's like, well, because we, for instance, we share a society. I don't wish to be killed. It would cause me emotional distress to see this happen, and so I have a vested interest in having this thing that I'm fine saying is wrong. But when I say wrong, I mean essentially thing I don't like and don't want to happen. It's like, I have a vested interest in not allowing that to occur. And is that at root maybe like an emotivist thing where it's essentially at root, it's just that I'm like, no, I don't like that. And not even I don't like that, but boo, if you want to go if you want to go that route. Like, that's fine. But I can give you a narrative of things that are very, sort of very, maybe tangible isn't the right word, but some of them I would say are pain aversion from a biological standpoint, shared culture and history. There's all these different things I can refer to. Whereas for me, the realist is saying, no, you shouldn't do that because it is like a stance independent fact that is wrong. And then when I ask them, can you demonstrate this in a way that is like really, really compelling? I typically, there, at least for me, it's, whether or not people find something compelling is somewhat subjective, but they're not able to do that. So I'm over here on my side. Once again, I'm saying I don't make this argument because it would be kind of uncharitable. But this reflexive thing on the side of realists, of acting like any position, of many realists, of acting like any position besides theirs is necessarily just this insubstantial thing, I think it's ridiculous, because I'm the one that can point to like cultural pressure, social pressure, history, biology, personal history, like all these very, very in like, can point to sort of directly as motivators or groundings, if you please, for like certain moral intuitions and things like this, whereas they're the one that is referring to essentially a concept that, in my experience, they're typically not able to they're just referring to this concept that they're not able to make a great case. So that reflexively dismissive attitude just drives me nuts, because it's like, once again, are we even doing the process of, is this even about meta ethics at this point? Because to me, the whole point of metaethics is supposed to be, I mean, we're human beings. We're going to have emotions. We're going to have these kind of things. That's fine. It happens. A similar thing happens in metaphysics. To me, it kind of happens in all of the different meta disciplines where it's like, what's the point of engaging in a meta discipline if we're not going to be able to like try to at least set a lot of that stuff aside and take a step back and to be able to like look at the field as a whole. And whether it's with certain positions in metaphysics or certain positions in metaethics, there's just this constant experience I have where it's like there will be a decent conversation happening, and then it's almost like someone, whether it's a particularly uncharitable moral realist or something, it's like they stagger through the door drunk, and they're suddenly like, "What's going on in here?" And then they just start slinging shit everywhere, and like it's incredibly frustrating because it's like, if you're actually interested in the topic of metaethics, then this is just not how you do that. It's not how, to me, it's not how you do philosophy. It's not how we should be comporting ourselves.
Well, they certainly think it is. Yeah, the grounding thing. I have a somewhat different approach to that than you do. It's interesting that we might have the same conclusions, but our sort of conversational or dialectical strategy emphasizes different points, like different junctures at which we take issue. On the grounding question, I think if you start offering those sorts of accounts, I can imagine the realist saying something like, well, those are just descriptive facts. You're just describing why you think that. You're not justifying it. You need a justification. And, it's funny because realists, and this, again, a lot of this generalizes outside of the context of moral realists, but will often take their own conceptions of things to be the only sense in which things can work. And if it's not that way, then you're toast. So I'll give an example, but I want to come back to the grounding thing. So I'll try to put a pin in that. This happens with companions and guilt arguments. So companions and guilt arguments basically work like this. They'll say, okay, well, you want to reject moral realism. Well, the reasons you have for rejecting moral realism would also be applicable to rejecting realism in this other normative domain, like epistemology or something like that. You wouldn't want to reject that, so you better accept realism. It's all or nothing, or moral realism. In other words, it's all or nothing. Either you have to accept both epistemic and moral realism, or you have to reject both. You don't want to reject both, so you got to accept both. That's the kind of argumentative strategy. And if you say, no, I reject epistemic realism, realists will say that this is self-defeating. And the reason it's self-defeating is because the only way you would be justified in rejecting any type of normative realism is if you had stance-independent epistemic norms that, according to which it was the case that you ought to reject these things. Why the hell would I accept that? It's not that I go, well, I think justification only works if epistemic realism is true, but it's not true, and I'm justified in thinking that. Well, then I'd be contradicting myself. But it's like, did it ever occur to realists that I could both disagree with epistemic realism and disagree that you need stance-independent epistemic normative truths in order to justify your positions? And if they go, no, but I'm stipulating that justification just is the process of providing stance-independent epistemic normative justification, fine. Then I reject your conception of justification too. I could just keep going. How many things do you want me to reject? Yeah. And the thing is, what they do is they'll say, okay, look, I was with you in rejecting moral realism, but now you're rejecting epistemic realism. You're rejecting my conception of justification. Look how many bullets you're biting. What? None of these are bullets. I didn't think any of these were plausible in the first place. This is, I've made this joke.
It's a bullet for you. It's not a bullet for me. Yeah.
Right. It's an open question. What is a bullet? Imagine, someone's like, look, you got to believe that aliens built the pyramids. And you're like, no. And they go, wait a minute. But if you're going to reject that, then you'd have to reject that there's a conspiracy to mix human and alien DNA. You'd have to reject that aliens built the moon. And you're like, yeah. And they're like, whoa, you're biting way too many bullets here. Are you going to tell me Bigfoot's not real? And you're, yeah, I am. Oh, too many bullets. So, like, if I don't buy into the whole bullshit project, somehow that's so many bullets that it's implausible. No, accepting any one of those theses would be the bullet. That would be the bullet. And if they just go, no, there's no independent standard they can appeal to insist I'm the one biting bullets, not them, without begging the question. That's something you would have to argue for. And guess what? They didn't argue for it. That's something they'd have to win in the court of dialectic. I'm not required to accept their starting assumptions. And so a lot of the way moral realists, and this happens all through, and it's not just realists, it's rationalistically or intuitive heavy anti-empiricist philosophers, is that they try to rig the game from the start, right? So they try to set up, oh, the data, we have to start with this is the data, or this is our starting point. And it, of course, favors them. So, hey, let's start playing a game of chess, but all my pawns are queens. Ha ha ha. And if you go, no, I don't accept that, this is where you get into a lot of trouble. The problem with historically why so few anti-realists have been rhetorically or in the literature more generally effective in combating moral realists is because anti-realists have been super passive with accepting many of the presumptions made by realists, even when the anti-realists are fantastic. I'll give an example. Richard Joyce is the most prominent contemporary error theorist. Great writer, great books, great papers. I love Richard Joyce's work. But Richard Joyce buys into like this moral nativist account that people have this strong capacity for thinking in distinctively moral terms, that they're predisposed toward this very realist conception of the world. The empirical evidence just doesn't support that. And that can be readily leveraged by realists to say that common sense is on their side. And error theorists tend to just go along with that. They go, yeah, people are realists. That's part of what error theory is. And that's one of the key problems with error theory is error theorists are conceding the empirical and semantic ground to realists. I don't think they should, because I don't think it's true. And there's very little buzz when researchers have challenged the seemingly sort of like realists are totally comfortable saying, look, on a surface level, we speak and act like realists. Even if it turns out that's not true, it at least looks that way. I don't even grant that it looks that way. And there's lots of reasons why. I've interviewed Nils Franzen on my YouTube channel, where he talks about how there's certain parts of the way that English works that, and this also works in other languages, that actually when you look at them only make sense on a subjectivist view and not on a realist view of the way that moral language operates. Like people saying, I find something to be the case. So it's totally natural to say, I find pizza to be delicious. It's also natural to say, I find abortion to be wrong. But it's not natural to say, I find trees to be plants. That sounds weird because we don't take that to be the sort of thing that's subject to how you find things. It just is that way. And so and he has a couple examples in the paper of parts of the way English, and again, other languages operate, where the language appears to function in a way where evaluative or normative language better fits with subjectivist accounts than realist accounts or non-subjectivist accounts. This is a paper that came out recently. Nobody noticed this for the past century. Nobody saw, and it's not like I've seen realists rebut this. This is just a piece of data in favor of like folk subjectivism. And again, totally ignored. So it's quite frustrating that, the way that the dialectic is set up. I do feel like we veered far away from the initial discussion of intuitions, though.
I didn't want to say one other thing, because you mentioned the what was the term again about the partners in
partners in crime. I wanted to go back to the that original point, and I think I lost the train of thought. What was the thing I was talking about?
I remember you saying put a pin in it.
Yeah, put a pin in it. Anyone in the chat remember? I see there's people here in the chat. What was it? That's what happens. I get into digression inception.
Yeah, it'll probably do that thing where it'll pop back.
Yeah.
We were talking about the presumption of correctness, and we were talking about
grounding. Oh, right, grounding.
Grounding, that's right. Yeah, because you were saying you hit it from a different angle than me.
Yeah, so I just say that I don't need grounding. So people will say, so never mind the descriptive stuff. I agree with you about all that, and I think that could be leveraged in a way that could be justificatory in a distinctively anti-realist framework, and that's fine. That's one approach. Another approach, though, is that if by grounding they're demanding some sort of foundation, basis, or rationale that would justify judging others or imposing your standards on others, I don't need it. So like some person is like, I'm gonna do terrible things. They're gonna like torture and enslave people. I'm gonna try to stop them if I can. I'm gonna oppose their actions. If somebody said, what's your justification? Well, do I need one? Why would I need one?
I'm just gonna do it. Yeah.
I'm just gonna do it. And if you don't like that, try to stop me, I guess. So,
Yeah.
like, what would realists do if they didn't have realism and their neighbor goes, I'm going to own a bunch of slaves? Would they go, well, damn, if I just had stance independent normative facts that could ground my moral position,
Yeah.
then I would be justified in stopping them. I don't have them, so I guess I got to let them keep slaves. Nah, I don't want them to have slaves. Good enough for me. Um,
Yep.
and it's very weird. Why do they think that? Do they need the universe's approval to do stuff? What the hell? It's a very
Yeah.
weird way of viewing things. And
Yeah.
if
Yeah.
anything, they like to make it seem like the anti-realists are these like psychopathic, terrible people, but they're the ones outsourcing their actions to facts, independent of their own values and standards. That's a little weird. I mean, imagine the Kantian, right? A really committed Kantian that says, "Look, my deepest desire is to just torture and kill everybody I see, but I'm a deontologist and I have an objective moral duty to abstain, so I'm going to abstain." And then imagine the emotivist that goes, torture and kill people. Ugh, no way. I want to help people and make the world a happy place for everybody. Please take my money and I'm going to do free doctor work. And you're like, wait, but you don't have a justification? And they're like,
Yeah.
no, not at all. I just want to do this stuff. I'm going with the second person. The first person is a scary person. And yet the psychology of the realist is closer to the first than the second, because they're the ones outsourcing the morality. I'm not outsourcing shit.
Mm-hmm.
So where do they get off trying to imply I'm a psychopath? I mean, imagine the flip, reverse rhetoric. If anti-realists went around going, wait, the only reason you don't murder people is because it's a stance independent obligation not to. You don't murder people because you don't want to. What the hell is wrong with you? Like, we could
You actually
be
hear
that
sometimes.
Yeah, sometimes.
Like I dealt with that a lot. Yeah.
Yeah, but we don't have the majority momentum on our side to push that as an effective rhetorical move.
I've always wondered to what degree that is actually true. Because I remember, like I said, growing up in sort of the high control religion thing, that's something I would hear quite often. And I remember, I'm not really into the new atheist stuff anymore, but I remember Dawkins hearing that once, and how he found it so bizarre. You'll sometimes hear in those circles people be like, oh, well, if I wasn't, saved, or however they want to say it, then, this idea of like, if I hadn't been saved, or however they think about it, who knows what absolutely hideous, abominable, horrible things I would get up to. Or I think the question that someone had asked Dawkins was like, well, if you don't, believe in God, which I guess you would say is, depending on people's opinions about it, is like a form of realism, whether it's divine command theory or what have you. It's like, well, what keeps you from like murdering and raping as much as you want? And he's like, I do murder and rape as much as I want, which is none. Like it's approaching it. And I've always wondered that the people that say those kind of things, like, oh, well, who knows what horrible things I'd be doing if I didn't have this belief, whether it be in God or stance independent moral facts. It's like, is that actually the case? Like, or is it that they sort of were, they sort of were bought into that idea? Because from the religious side of things, because I can speak more to that, there is a like I said, I this was my belief for the first 20 years of growing up, that as a human being, I was flawed and sinful and depraved and all these other kind of things. And so there literally was that underlying belief that, like, but for the grace of God type of a thing, there go I, if it weren't for Christ, I would be doing every abominable act humanly imaginable. And so I think it does make, when I say sense, obviously I don't agree with it, but it does, you can see where it can sort of feed into that kind of thinking. Whereas what I've tried to get across in my conversations with people is, first of all, you were saying the partners in crime thing. Something I've noticed all the time with moral realists is they very commonly, they want to talk about moral, whether they're sort of a platonic moral realist, or sometimes the naturalist types will do it as well. They like to use this analogy where they want to say that stance independent moral facts are of a kind with something like math. And that's the most common thing I've dealt with of that partners in crime thing, because they will then try to say, well, if you doubt this, then you also have to doubt something like math. And first of all, that's not true, but I don't even feel the need to take the bait there to give my opinions about what math is, because that's a whole separate conversation. But my thing is, I don't even buy that to begin with. I don't think I don't think it's like my thinking on it. I don't think it's a system like math. I think it's a system like money or like fiat currency. And I think that's what I realized is like there's just a really fundamental difference in view on what morality I think even is and sort of what its function is in the world. Because as the last person I talked to who was a realist, we got down to it. Um, because they like to bring up, and they'll say they're doing it because the extreme makes the point or that it's an intuition pump or something. But I'm really really tired of like it's like you can almost guarantee and set your clock that like 2 minutes into a conversation with a realist they'll be talking about baby torture. And it's like let's yeah it's like and then slavery is the other one, and that was the wall I ran into this last time, was that it was like how can you I'm trying to think how the person phrased it because I don't want to misrepresent them. They were like, you can't, from with how you're talking about things, you can't make the statement that slavery was always wrong. And on the one side of me I was like, well, I can say whatever I want. But another side of me I was like, I don't even, to me there's so much baked even into that statement that sort of presumes things that I just don't agree with. Because it's like, I'm me, I'm here now, based on what I know now, regardless of when you ask me to think about slavery, I think it's wrong. But this person then said, I was like, but I just don't understand what it is that you're getting. I said this to him. What are you getting out of how you're viewing it? He said, it buys you the right to say that it was always wrong. And I'm like, this is just interacting with like sort of time and such in a weird way. Like, why? Like, and it's so hard to even talk about these things because it's like there's always this undercurrent of like, if you don't express disdain for slavery in the same way that I do, that means you don't disdain it as much as I do, which is
Yep.
bullshit.
It's not
And
true. It
it's
doesn't
like,
follow.
it's not, it does exactly, it doesn't follow at all. It's like, no, I disapprove of slavery. I, Me saying, "Oh, well, now have the right because of this view. It now buys me the right to say that." No, you asked me, "How do you feel about slavery in the 1800s or the 1600s or the year 500?" I'm repulsed by it. I think it was awful. Do I think that people at that time maybe have the same level of moral responsibility for their behavior as someone who's doing it now would, with ostensibly a more modern set of? No, because then to me comes to the question of like, what do you think the nature of moral responsibility is? Do you think that people can be morally responsible for things they're not aware of? And I don't even think our entire legal system is built on that idea, because that's why we literally have things like manslaughter, first degree murder, second degree murder, third degree murder. Like, it matters what you know at the time. And so all that to say, you just end up at this loggerheads where it's like, you obviously they think I'm incorrect, and obviously think how I'm talking about it is strange. But if nothing else, I've tried, because the people I've had full conversations with are good people, and they're not intentionally nasty. And that's been the main thing I've tried to get across to them is like, can you at least see where I'm coming from, and how you're approaching this just does not map onto how I think literally anything works or functions. And the same thing with the grounding idea. It's like, well, how can you as far as the article I wrote, the main thing I came to is, to me, the whole thing is about, it's about moral agreement and whether or not you can reach agreement. And so therefore I think that my view actually subsumes realism, because believing in stance independent facts is a thing. It is a view you can share with other people in order to coordinate your behavior. But if you don't share that, then you have to appeal to something else. But that's literally how it works, because that's how I get along with moral realists. Because it doesn't matter that they think that murder is stance independently morally wrong, and my feeling that murder is wrong is rooted in the fact that I don't want to die and those other things I don't fucking care. And I made the point that it genuinely doesn't even matter if the shared agreement is on a falsehood. If you had a culture that The only reason they didn't have a aversion or any of these other things, they didn't believe in stance independent moral facts, is the only reason that culture thought that murder was wrong is they thought that if you killed another human being, that person's ghost would haunt you and magically give you AIDS. That's false. But their moral system would still work and it would still result in them not engaging in the act of murder. So there's just a completely different, like, it really does feel ultimately like there's a completely different conversation even being had. And on the back of that, and honestly, we can use this to tie it back to intuitions. Do you think that this is that this sort of divide, even if, okay, we'll put it this way, even if all parties were being charitable and engaging in good faith, whether we're talking about how these people approach intuition, how people are approaching morality, do you think it is something where even if people were all sort of well behaved on both sides, that this is a something that can be sort of rectified? Or do you think that people are coming from such fundamentally sort of different ways that they maybe think about truth and knowledge and how the world works, that it's just never going to mesh up? Like, not that it's a waste of time, but like, do you think that you know
Yeah.
it's possible?
So I think certain individuals involved, and let's construe this as there being roughly two sides. I think that there are going to be people on both sides that are effectively incorrigible. They're never going to change their mind.
Mm.
But if you could improve the quality of the discourse between them, if you can improve clarity, transparency, if you can get rid of the biases, you get rid of the rhetoric, you minimize all that, and you get people having more productive discussions. Even if at the end of those discussions, the incorrigible people remain unconvinced, which they would be, audiences matter, students matter, the newest generation matters. Think of it like everybody involved in these conversations has varying degrees of how much room they have to vary. So you can think of it like all your beliefs are along this little spectrums, and the older you get and the more ossified your views become, the smaller and smaller and smaller it gets. And it could go this way, it could go this way, it can move towards the middle, but eventually it's going to lock in. And so some people, they're just locked in down the whole run. They're not going to change their mind on anything. Other people, one thing is a little open. Other people, they're all wide open. And so people are going to vary in the degree of corrigibility they have along a whole bunch of different dimensions. And so when we enter into these conversations, that some people may be incorrigible on some things doesn't mean there aren't a whole bunch of corrigible people that could be impacted by those discourses, even between two incorrigible people. So two people that'll never change their mind, argue, and that affects everybody else. And so I have some hope that there's enough corrigibility in enough of the newest saplings growing up in philosophy. And I'd like to think I'm still at that point, but maybe that's becoming increasingly not true. I can't see myself becoming a realist, but who knows? I can't picture it. But the hope is that there could be progress among those people. But I think what that progress will have to be will require us to go into metaphilosophy, into the foundations. I think that we need a better handle on what the heck we're doing. We need to step outside of the mainstream analytic philosophical framework and start asking more fundamental questions about what the heck we're doing and how it's supposed to work. And that's where I come in with this stuff about intuitions. So this intuition talk, something intuition-like has very likely, and from all indications, been at least part of Western philosophy since its inception. That does appear to be the case. Now, whether or not intuitions have played the specific evidentiary or epistemic or methodological role that contemporary analytic philosophers put them to is an open question. So Herman Capellan, I don't know how to say his name. I never know the names. Has a book called Philosophy Without Intuitions. And what he argues in that book is that historically speaking, many of the, and he points to certain examples of prominent 20th century works in philosophy, many historical examples of prominent arguments where you might think the proponent of the argument was appealing to intuitions, they actually don't. And that intuitions as playing this special epistemic role in arguments is not an entirely accurate portrayal of the recent history of analytic or Western philosophy more broadly. I don't know exactly how he frames it. Now, I don't know how much of that I'm on board with, but I do think he makes a good case if you look carefully. At the very least, philosophers 50, 60, 70, 80 years ago did not speak like philosophers today. James Andow has a paper on the explosion of intuition talk. And so intuition talk has certainly reached epidemic proportions among analytic philosophers. And Andow, I think, traces it in part to Chomsky and it's the rise of the use of the concept in linguistics. And that sort of boiled out into other fields. And so the question is whether the talk has been accompanied by a shift in how philosophers actually conceive of what they're doing. And there is metaphilosophical work on that. You've got Jennifer Nato and quite a few other people that have written about and spoken about what intuitions are, how they work, what their role is, and all that sort of thing. The issue is that it does seem to me that almost everybody in these exchanges takes for granted that intuitions are real. And I don't. I don't take it for granted that they're real. If somebody says, by intuition, I mean a disposition to believe things. Well, do I think people have dispositions to believe things? Absolutely. People are all a disposition to believe things that could be cashed out in entirely behavioristic terms. Like you just predict, would this group of people be more likely to believe this than that group of people? Well, I know their political orientation. So I know that, like, okay, so take a group of people that identify as Republicans rather than Democrats in the United States. Are they more likely to support a bill restricting abortion access? Of course they are, on average. So they have a disposition to oppose abortion practices or whatever. That's trivial to establish, that people have dispositions to believe things. That's not the only construal of intuition. If you go to the Stanford Encyclopedia entry on intuition, you'll see a range of different characterizations. And you do have people, Williamson, will say, look, intuition is just this fudge term that we use, where really the way intuition is used in philosophy is used in almost every circumstance or for almost any type of mental state. Judgments, beliefs, whatever. The stuff it's referring to is utterly mundane. It's totally normal stuff. There's nothing to see here. It's just a funny way that we talk that sometimes serves this fudge factor or obscuring factor. So some people view it that way, but I don't think that that's quite right, because you do have people like Beeler, Bingson, Humer, maybe Russ Schaefer-Landau, maybe Terence Cuneo. I notice I'm naming a bunch of meta-ethicists mostly, but it doesn't have to be just them. Beeler, I don't think is. And there's a variety of other people, but I'm mostly familiar with the meta-ethics people. Anyway, some of them are very explicit in saying, look, when I'm talking about intuitions, I am not talking about disposition. Like Humer very explicitly says, I am not talking about dispositions to believe things. I'm not. He'll say that he's referring to a specific type of mental state. And then he cashes this out in terms of saying it's about how things seem. He calls them intellectual appearances. I think he uses appearances. It's seemings or appearances, maybe use both. In any case, a variety of philosophers maintain that intuitions involve the application or use of a distinctive faculty of intuition. Or they'll say that intuitions are sui generis, like they can't really be understood in other terms. They're not reducible to other types of psychological states. They'll say that they have a special kind of phenomenology. So just like vision has a particular kind of presentation and hearing has a particular kind of present, there's a way hearing is, there's a way seeing is. And then there's a way philosophical intuitions are, where you see things, and then you also have intellectual appearances. They're not vision, they're not hearing, they're their own thing. So there are philosophers that explicitly say, I am doing this. This is what I take myself to be doing. And what I find strange about that is that there's very little evidence, empirical evidence, that that's a real type of psychological faculty. And then what will happen when I try reading this sort of thing is often the proponents of these claims insist that they're not speaking in empirical terms, or they're not making empirical claims. If you claim that you're having a certain kind of mental state or a certain kind of experience, you're making an empirical claim. Now, if they're just saying, and we're talking about qualia, fine. But if there are functional or behavioral effects of you having an intuition or reacting a certain way, or if it triggers or activates certain kinds of psychological processes in the brain or something like that, you're talking about psychology, and then it falls within the realm of empirical inquiry. And the issue is just that there's not a whole lot of evidence that that's a particular kind of thing. Now, philosophers just seem to think the fact that they're self-reporting that they're having these is adequate to establish that they are in fact having them. But then, people like, I think it's Bingson, will say that part of what it means for something to be an intuition is that it's it's fitting, it has a fitting relation to the propositions over which the intuition operates, or they play some other sort of justifying role epistemically, where they warrant or justify or bolster or support. You throw in the epistemic term you want. I don't know exactly what he says, of whatever it is that you have the intuition about. How, first of all, if that's part of the definition, now it's certainly an open question whether they exist or not. If you're just saying, look, this is a non-negotiable feature of what the mental state is. Well, if it turns out we don't have mental states of that feature, we don't have intuitions. If you're saying that, so what they'll do is they'll attribute all of these characteristics to intuitions. Okay, well now it's an open question whether or not we actually have psychological processes that fit that description. Where's the evidence for that? And the answer is they don't appear to have much evidence for it. And no one appears to be doing research on, or not, I shouldn't say nobody. There's not a lot of research on this. And the people that make these sorts of claims typically seem deeply allergic to any type of empirical research. They seem disinterested in it. They seem to think it's irrelevant, or they just ignore or omit any discussion of it. And so I hold a view that I don't think I've heard anybody else hold. I don't think these kinds of intuitions are real. I think they do not exist. Now, that might sound silly, but think about all the types of psychological processes people already think are real. Telepathy, if it's real, is a psychological state, because it's like if you're reading someone else's mind, you're doing it with your mind. You're doing it with your brain or something. I mean, if this is supposed to be a natural or physiological process, it's certainly going to involve your brain. If you think it's some sort of supernatural or non-natural thing that doesn't involve the brain, how are you getting knowledge of what's in the other person's mind? Doesn't it have? It has to go in your brain, right? Okay, so if you use telepathy and then you remembered that you used telepathy on somebody yesterday, aren't you using your brain for the memory? Like, isn't memory stored in the brain? So how are you going to escape the fact that somewhere down the line, relevant considerations about your psychology are going to come into the picture? Okay, so telepathy, that's a type of partially a type of psychological phenomenon. Precognition. Astral projection, any type of paranormal thing involving the human mind, mind control, whatever you think it is, those are going to involve something related to psychology. Why would intuition somehow be magically exempt from this kind of scrutiny? Now, supposing they are a type of psychology, well, consider telepathy and precognition. Anybody here in the audience or that's listening to this at any point can go look up what percentage of Americans believe in telepathy or precognition or these sorts of things. What percentage of people in other countries? We have data on these sorts of things. People have done surveys. These are huge percentages. Now, what percentage of people report having philosophical intuitions in the sense that Beeler or Humer or Binkson would? Well, I'm not even sure most philosophers report having them. And there's a few tens of thousands of philosophers, maybe? I mean, they're less than 1% of the U.S. population, and the U.S. is probably per capita one of the greatest producers of professional philosophers. So if you look at the rest of the world, they're going to have a lot fewer philosophers on average than the United States. And so most people are not philosophers. Most people haven't studied philosophy a whole lot. And even those that have studied philosophy haven't specifically encountered these particular characterizations of intuition. So how many people report having these kinds of intuitions? If I had to hazard a guess, it's something less than 1%. And so if we're talking idiosyncratic, it doesn't get much more idiosyncratic than that. Notice too that the distribution of the 1% matters, right? So if a particular psychological thing cropped up in 1% of the world's population, but it was randomly distributed across different cultures and populations, you might think, oh, that's a rare thing that people can do, right? So like a disease that only arose in certain places, a disease that arose in 1 out of a million people all over the world in every population. Okay, sounds plausible. But when a phenomena only appears to emerge among a specific group of people with similar training, experience, and education, now you can start to get suspicious. So let me give the
it's almost like a
example that
mimetic
I wanted
contagion
to
or something at that point, possibly.
Sorry, what?
I said this might be uncharitable. I said, but at that point, it almost seems like it just could be something more like almost like a mimetic like contagion or something.
That's what I think it is.
Yeah, particular group of
That
people.
is what I think it is. So some people believe they can see auras, and by that I don't mean like aura like with migraine headaches or something like that. I mean like the paranormal thing where people have like energy fields around them, and different colors correspond to different, like, oh, this person has, I don't know the colors or what. Oh, this person has a green aura, they're jealous. They have a red aura, they're angry. They're
Yeah.
an unhinged person with low inhibition or something like that. So people believe that they could detect energy fields around other people, and they may even believe they could visually observe those energy fields. Now, can anybody actually do this? I think probably not. Now, grant, for the sake of argument, auras are not real and people can't actually see them. What's actually happening when people claim that they see auras? Are they all just liars, just outright self-consciously lying, gun to their heads? They'd be like, I was making them up. I don't think so. I think people genuinely believe they could see auras. So something is going on with them psychologically, but it's not what they themselves think that it is. So if you ask them, can you see auras? They go, yeah. So you can see energy fields around people. Yeah, you've got a purple energy field. Pretty cool. And it does look like I have a purple energy field. So they would report that. Is that what's actually happening? No. So something psychological is going on, but it's not what they think it is. Now, I think something is going on with philosophers that report having sui generis intuitions or these intellectual seemings. That doesn't mean that it's what they think that it is. What I think is actually going on is something quite similar to people learning to see auras. Now, right now, we can imagine a guru. Let's suppose they're a sincere believer in seeing auras. They could take a class of 100 people and say, I'm going to teach you to see auras. You have to meditate 10 hours a day for the next 6 weeks. And slowly over time, you'll build up your capacity to see people's energy fields. I'm going to train you how to do it. And, he goes and he like looks at people and he squints. Ooh, you can see the purple around him. Can you see it? You could imagine this person convincing at least a few of those people to like see, they could see auras. They're basically, you could train people to become self-deluded. Now take what happens in philosophy. When I was a student, I remember encountering the trolley problem, the footbridge, and the switch case. And I was being asked, what is your intuition in the footbridge? And I actually remember, of course, who knows, memories are reconstructed and maybe not entirely accurate. But I remember being ambivalent and going, well, you would be killing one person to save 5 people. I wouldn't want to kill a person, but it would save 5 people. So it's the utility maximizing thing, but it's deeply repugnant and unpleasant to have to push somebody to their death. So I noticed my psychology. I didn't have the true response is to push or to not push. And yet when I reported this, that I didn't have an intuition in a particular direction, I was put under some pressure. I don't know if this was in the classroom where I encountered this or in discussions outside of the class. I don't remember exactly where this occurred. But I remember having pressure like, but come on, don't you have the intuition? Don't you have it? Don't you have it? Same thing happened when people tried to get me to have qualia intuitions. And it doesn't seem to me like there's an ineffable qualitative property to seeing red. I'm not getting it. I've had people tell me that I was pretending for attention. That person backed off when I said, I'm not particularly enjoying this attention. I'd rather not have it. And then they were like, well, fair enough. It'd be weird for you to try to get attention and then if you don't want the attention. So that person actually said, that's a good point. That it was clear I was not enjoying the conversation. So I felt kind of annoyed by it. But I've had people tell me I'm pretending or lying to not have intuitions. And so I experienced personally direct personal pressure repeatedly in different universities, no less, to report having intuitions. And when I reported that I wasn't having an intuition, this was met with suspicion, explicit and immediate accusations that I was lying or pretending. I mean, it doesn't get much more social pressure than that, than for someone to say, you're lying. I know you have it. So imagine hundreds, if not thousands of people going to these classrooms where year after year after year, professors and students have collectively reported intuitions. And if someone goes, I don't think I have that. Yes, you do. Yes, you do. Yes, you do. Now, I'm the type of person that I grew up, I hated bullies and I hated social pressure and I don't like social conformity. So when people try to compel me to socially conform, I react with hostility. Fuck you. I'll think whatever I want. I said I don't have an intuition. I don't have an intuition. And if you call me a liar, I don't want to talk to you anymore. Go fuck yourself. That was my reaction on it. Sorry to be I don't know if you have rules here, but that was my reaction.
No, I do not.
Okay, cool. So that was my reaction to that is fuck off. I don't have it. And I will not be socially pressured into reporting something I don't have. And what's frustrating is because I did not lie and pretend, I've been repeatedly accused of lying after that. So because of my unwillingness to lie, I have been subjected to, for now, over 20 years of accusations that I'm lying about this. It's infuriating. I am not lying about it, and it really pisses me off when people accuse me of that because it's something that, like, I ended up getting super interested in this and like dedicating my life to this. And then people call me a
Mm.
liar about it. Really. So I just spent the past 20 years dedicated to bullshitting all of you. Really. And that's a point I always like to make to people. Like, I really want to like bring my wife onto the camera and say to her, like, hey, do I say the same things you see me saying in streams and videos to you privately? And she'd be like, yes, but way worse. Like, you're way
Yeah,
more emphatic.
yeah.
You're way more aggressive about it. And she can easily explain that in my friends group. So do these people
Mm,
that think I'm lying think that I've decided to lie in my private life to everybody I
mm.
love and care about nonstop and keep up the act privately for my whole life? I mean, that's psychotic. But maybe they think I'm a psycho. So anyway, what I think is basically happening is what I call philosophical induction. And what I
Mm.
think is happening is that students or people that start training, reading, or learning philosophy are induced into thinking that when they encounter a Gettier problem or the trolley problem or Mary's room, that they're supposed to have what I mockingly call a truth tingle. Like, they're supposed to consider the set of options, and then
Mm.
one of the options tingles just right to them. They have a little tingle in the
Mm.
direction of it. There's something special, and of course I'm making fun of this idea, but I don't
Mm.
have that. I've never had that in response to anything. I have inclinations to believe things. I have non-inferential judgments about things, or at least if there are inferences, they're not introspectively accessible. I make judgments like that all the time. That's not what I'm denying. What I'm specifically denying is this like weird sui generis quasi-perceptual truth detection ability that Humor and
Mm.
others think that they have. I'm not saying we have that ability, but I don't think that it works very well. I'm saying literally nobody has that ability. It's
Mm.
pseudopsychology, it's fake, it doesn't exist, and they do not have intuitions. What they have is analogous to somebody thinking that they could see auras. And as far as I know, I've never heard anybody else propose this. I'm not trying to be special here. I really want to know if other people propose this. I would rather not be the one person saying this, because people can say I'm a fringe crackpot if I do. So please find other people that agree with me about this. But that's basically what I think. So that's my
Yeah.
spiel on intuitions. I basically think that the sui generis kind, they're not real. I think it's pseudopsychology.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the looking it up in the dictionary for just the word intuition, and there's a variety of things. But when I looked it up, the first, and that's just for the word intuition, and not even for philosophical intuition specifically. The first definition I saw was the faculty. It was like the faculty of knowing without reasoning or evidence, and I'm like, well, like faculty is a strong word. Like, that's essentially the ability to know without, and it's like, and that's where I kind of wonder. It's like, I feel like they even think that that's a thing. Like, it's like, I think that you I mean, obviously I don't agree, but do you think it grows out of just a um maybe just a completely different view of the idea of knowledge and truth and such, that obviously we don't share, where people think that human beings just do have a faculty of just knowing stuff. Like, I
I,
I don't think that, but like
I think
it.
knowing involves using your brain, and that
Mhm.
any way you know anything, your brain has to be doing something. It's got to be doing
Mhm.
something. So, like, if I know there's a cup here now, the only way I could know this, maybe there's some non-empirical stuff involved. I don't think that, but maybe there is. But there's at least some empirical stuff involved, and we could talk about what that empirical stuff is. Like, I need my eyes. I need to be able to feel the cup. If I could see the
Mhm.
cup and then I reached out and my hand was going right through it and I couldn't interact with it in any way, I would start freaking out. Like, my senses give me mutually convergent, corroborating evidence that I'm interacting with that part of the world around me. Um, so, like, a sense experience certainly has this ability to provide knowledge or information about the world. I say certainly. I don't mean that in the like necessarily. I'm not using that in some deep philosophical sense. Just like it's the kind of thing I don't think any of us are really disputing here. But like just the you could just know things. Like Humor talks about things being self-evident. Um,
Mhm.
I, what the hell? I don't think anything is self-evident. I don't even think like 2 + 2 = 4 is self-evident. I think it's all stuff
Mhm.
that's constructed and learned, and I don't think any of it is self-evident. But yeah, when they start talking about knowledge and intuition in these contexts, there is such a tendency to push against any connection to the sciences and psychology. And historically, people that had similar views to me, like Schiller, would be accused of things like a psychologism, like this, or like this. It's almost like scientism, but with psychology. Like, oh, you're saying this is all psychological. Yeah, I am, and this
Mm,
this is just sneered at by some
mm,
philosophers. So yeah, I do think that they have a very different conception of how these things work, um, and that's that's not going to fly when they say things like most people have these intuitions, or
mm,
most people have these experiences, or all psychologically normal people have these experiences. So all psychologically normal people have these experiences. Okay, well, now you're making a claim that implies that the absence of the experience involves psychological like pathology, which would
mm,
imply some type of neurodevelopmental or
yeah,
disorder or physical impairment in the brain. So okay, so if you think people have a neurodevelopmental or disorder or they're brain damaged, prove it. Like, fine, that's
yeah,
operationalizable. Go find those people. Show me the lesions in their brain. And I've had people mock me for suggesting this. No, I counter mock you. This is ridiculous. If you say I'm
mm.
defective mentally, fucking prove it. Like, I will get in the MRI. You have a theory about which like, look, Josh Green has talked about this. So Josh Green has his dual process model of moral cognition, and they've done research on people that have, say, damage to the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, and if this part of the brain does the thing that we think it does, and it's impaired, then we should expect people to have this response if they have some sort of lesion in that part of the brain. Or these days, we could test with transcranial magnetic stimulation. You can sort of tune down the activation of a certain region of the brain temporarily using TMS, and then see if there's a behavioral change. And sure enough, you can make predictions about this and find out how certain parts of the brain are associated with certain kinds of behavior. Now, is it easy? No. Is fMRI going to resolve all our problems? No. There's a whole bunch of problems with reverse inferences, a whole bunch of methodological hurdles in using these tools appropriately and effectively and convincingly and robustly. But the effort is better than just throwing up your hands and not doing any of that and pretending, or not. I shouldn't say pretending, because I don't know what these people's intentions are, seeming to be oblivious or disinterested or not care about doing any of this sort of research, and yet still, like, the same, a person will in one breath say that they don't care about empirical psychology at all, and then in the next breath say if you don't share their intuitions you have brain damage. Well, then apparently you do
Mm.
care about psychology, so you're full of shit. So you know
It's yeah,
philosophers do this all the time. They talk about what people believe, what people think, what people say. Those are empirical claims.
mm,
They just are. And it's beyond tedious for them to just keep denying that they're making empirical claims. But this
yeah.
stuff about intuitions, I don't know how no one is challenging this. Where the hell did they get the idea that they have a special truth detection power? And why should I think they have it? What is
Well, I
this
mean, I
coming
don't
from?
think, yeah, and I don't think, obviously it's from my own experience, but sort of talking to you about this, it's making me realize, I think, why it bothers me so much. You were talking about, growing up and the, sort of, I guess you'd say dispositionally yourself being like, don't tell me I'm lying, don't, like this kind of a thing. And I'm realizing that, like, the reason it bothers me so much, I think, is because of my background coming up in this very culty sort of form of religion. I'm not trying to badmouth all religion, but honestly, the more I'm thinking about it, behaviorally, it's almost identical. It's this sort of dogmatism because I dealt with the kind of thing growing up all the time. When I first started to question my faith, I would be asking what were very legitimate questions. And instead of engaging with the questions, I would very often, and this would just send me through the roof angry, because I would very often be like, well, what about this? And I would constantly, well, you would get this like shut up type of a thing, or I would constantly get this incredibly condescending thing. And this was within the structure of my faith and religion, of them going, well, now, Ishmael, that fill in blank. And that would send me through the roof, because I'm like, don't fucking tell me what I know. Like I remember, and it still angers me, but I would get really, really, really angry when I was younger, because to me that was such a deeply insulting thing for you to try to tell me something that I know, when I obviously don't fucking know it, because I'm here asking the questions and I'm questioning the idea. And I'm realizing, like, in terms of the behavior, and I think in terms of the why it's going on so much, it might be something very similar, because whether it's a philosophy or religion or anything, like these are still human beings, and if this has started to sort of take over as like a prevailing dogma, essentially, not everyone has your kind of disposition to be like to actually kick back, because you were talking about that as far as students and stuff, where you were able when you were younger to be like, yeah, no, I'm not lying, I'm telling you this is what. Whereas when you think about the trolley problem, I imagine there's probably a lot of students, there's probably students that do just immediately go, oh nope, you do this thing, because different people are different. But there's probably a lot of students where if they were like, oh, I don't really know, even if they didn't get to like, oh, you're lying, no, you have a thing, which is sort of the aggressive version. There's also another version where people are like, are you sure? Come on. Oh, don't you really? You know what I mean? There's like this cajoling, condescending kind of thing. And most people, because if you look at psychologically, if you look at, like the agreeableness and different things like this, a lot of people are agreeable. They don't want to get criticized. They don't want to stand out. They're not like what maybe you might call with like what I've been described as like a naive fixation on truth kind of a thing, where it's like, no, fuck you, like this very, I can get kind of lasered on some of this stuff. Um, and I think that just leads to this loop, because it's like, whether they really intend to or not, once again, that would be psychologizing. But when you have someone who's really stuck in maybe this sort of like realist or this intuition kind of talk mentality, either intentionally or unintentionally, if they're so sure and they're just projecting this confidence, and then it's likely they might even be going to other people and be like, oh, come on, don't you, they're like, oh, don't you have to, oh, come on, this, right? And a lot of people, aren't going to be like you or maybe me, where they're like, no, don't fucking tell me what I know. They're like, oh, yeah, okay, sure. And then for the realist, it ends up probably in this cycle of them being like, well, everyone I ask, it's like, is it maybe because you're a pushy prick about it?
Yeah. The pushy thing. Like, I get this from realists all the time. Oh, well, all my students come in and say that they're relativist until I start pushing back, and then they recant their relativism. Well, I'd like to see how that goes down. So, students like, I'm a
Mhm.
relativist, and then like, oh, so you don't think Hitler did anything wrong? Oh,
Yeah.
well, yeah. Oh,
Yeah.
yeah. That's
Baby
what I
torture's
thought.
fine. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, baby
So
torture.
like, and then
Right
they're
to the
like,
baby
see, the
torture
student
and the seal killing.
retreated immediately, and it's like, well, yeah, because no one's going to stick their neck out and like try to defend Hitler just because they're a
Especially not to an
relative,
authority figure. Yeah, it's their
right? In front
professor,
of an
Yeah.
audience, right? In front of a whole
Yep.
classroom. So,
Yep.
I mean, are realists just outrageously naive and don't realize the social pressure they're putting people under, and not realizing? I mean, are they naive or stupid? Because it's one of the two. I mean, it's
Mm.
that's ridiculous to think that is an appropriate testing ground for seeing whether a person's committed to relativism. And realists just seem to can't help but seem to constantly moralize disagreement with their
Mm.
position, and try to paint you to be an evil asshole if you hold a contrary view. And then naturally, unprepared undergraduates, I mean, keep in mind all the social pressures. They don't want to look terrible, awful, or stupid to their professor. They don't want to look like a monster in front of their friends. They don't want to get
Cheers, yeah.
canceled. People are recording this crap, right? Every class is
Mm.
being recorded now, probably. The larger it is, the more likely someone's recording it. Um, they don't want to get canceled. They don't want to look like an asshole in front of their friends. They don't want their professor to hate them. And their grade is on the line. And they're under massive immediate social pressure that they're unprepared for, and are not taught the kinds of responses. They don't have the tools and resources I would have if I were put under that kind of pressure. And so naturally they retreat from the position. And then the professor can herald the triumph that their students realized their error.
The
I mean,
truth
it's just
of
such
yeah.
a
Yeah.
noxiously silly and presumptuous way to approach things. I could tell you right now, I have almost unanimity in self-reported relativism or anti-realism among my students, and I do survey them at the end of the class. You want to take a guess how many of my students give up their relativism or anti-realism at the end of the class? Basically none.
None.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's because I'm not putting them under social pressure. I teach them about the relevant concepts and distinctions. What I don't do is try to push realism on them. And so, what a surprise! My students don't retreat, and theirs do. I wonder if that has to do with them pushing the realism onto them. I mean,
Mm.
has this really not occurred to them?
Yeah.
Oh my God! I mean,
Probably not. Yeah. I mean, maybe not.
I mean, it's just so
That's what's hard.
naive.
Yeah.
It's
That's what's
naive.
hard,
It's ridiculous.
because if you do like because I've been correlating it with some of it probably just depends, honestly, because like my experience as I said, coming out of the really culty religion type thing, like I think there's, and maybe there would be a way of teasing this out of what exactly is going on, because I'm not trying to drag it to religion. It's just because I'm more comfortable talking about that. Because I think a lot of the structure is the same, where it's like, you'll hear people when they talk about the kind of religion I came out of, this really culty stuff, where it's like people will be like, oh, well, those people, they're all psychopaths, or they're all morons, or they, like you'll hear these different sort of takes. And my thing is that, like, or nobody actually believes that stuff. They're just faking for this reason or that reason. And my thing is that I'm not sure, but based on watching people behave in those circles, I think it's a big mix of things. I think that, say, if you have like a culty kind of environment, which, I mean, honestly, I think there can be culty kind of philosophical circles, definitely, where you have some writer, and then you've got all these acolytes of a particular writer, and they're all enthralled to, oh, well, so and so, and you even hear the language. I've heard certain philosophers reference, and the person will be like, so and so teaches us that. I'm like, what the fuck? Like, that sends my cult alarm bells off hard. That kind of
Yeah,
language,
and it should.
like,
Yeah,
yeah,
I see
like,
that
oh,
with
so and so
Hegelians
teaches us
sometimes.
that. Yeah, he teaches us that such and so, and it's like, what the fuck? Don't talk like that. Like, it really, with my background, that really bothers me. I'm like, I don't like that at all. And so, but that's the thing, is like, you can, and psychology is your area, you can look at these things of like, oh, well, cult leaders even. It's like, are all of them just completely cynical bullshitters who are just making shit up to manipulate people? Some, I think you could make a good case, are. Some of them maybe started out that way, and then they start to kind of believe and drink their own Kool-Aid because they say it so much. And then you've got people that sort of enable them under them. And then you've got people who are just followers, and they just kind of want to be a part of what's going on. You've got people that are there, that is how I ended up being, that are just going along because they're confused and they're fucking terrified, and they don't want to get their head whacked off until such a point as their conscience and their reason and other things make it that they just can't fucking take it anymore, and they refuse to do it. Like, it's human. It's this mess, and it's an interesting question, I think, sort of anthropologically, of like, what is really going on in any of these sort of, things that get sort of organizationalized and then like propagated, where it does seem like there comes a point where they really don't, they obviously don't care about the same things. I'll speak for myself, that I care about, you know like, they don't care about intellectual consistency. They don't care, they don't care about these things. And at a certain point, it's, I do agree with what you said, though, and that's sort of, I think, the whether it's debate or conversation, you know it depends. I think it does depend. That's the big question with debate, is it's like, I don't really debate people anymore who are, as you said, incorrigible, if it's like one on one. But I will do it if it's in front of other people, not to pwn on them or to school them or anything like that, but because there's a good chance that that type of incorrigible person, because they tend to be incredibly pushy and shit, they might be like domineering a certain group of people, and those people might never see someone actually push back on that incorrigible person. They're just being essentially intellectually dominated by that person who's just slinging so much confidence and so much charisma and so much whatever else, that they're not seeing the pushback. And so I do agree with you that I think there's definitely value still in the discourse, even if you know that the person that you're talking to is not going to come around or anything like that. It's not going to be productive for them, but in a level, sort of, fuck them. There still needs to be a public showing that, look, there is another way to look at this. This is not
Mhm.
what this person is saying is not a foregone conclusion. It's not even close to a foregone conclusion.
Yeah, so I don't mind the comparisons to religion at all. I do think that there is some overlap. The problem is, and it's something I like to coin terms for things and hope that they catch on. It's something I call the over comparison fallacy. And sorry, so the over comparison fallacy. Sometimes when you compare two things, you compare them with respect to one dimension. Like I could compare
Mm,
blood and a fire truck and say, hey,
mm,
they're both red. Now, it would be
mm,
ridiculous for someone to say, you can't compare blood and a fire truck. One is a vehicle and one is a fluid inside the human body. Uh,
mm,
yeah, that's true. Why can't I compare them? I'm comparing them in the sense of them both being red. They are both red. So when you compare things along one dimension, This does not entail or imply that you're comparing them with respect to any other characteristics or
Everything,
properties.
yeah.
So when you say, if someone were to say, some of the ways in which philosophical education proceeds is reminiscent in some ways of how cults maintain and foster membership and obedience, I think that that could be true without it implying, for instance, that philosophers are like a bunch of manipulative abusers that are exploiting students for like sex and money or something. Because that's not true. This
No.
has happened, I'm sure, here and
Yeah,
there on
yeah.
occasion. But generally speaking, philosophers are ordinary, nice, sincere people that are trying to do their best, just like everybody else. I don't have a problem with philosophers on an interpersonal level. Um, but there are sociological forces in play that people may not realize, that the
Mhm.
institutions that they represent and work within can have a sort of self-reinforcing momentum of induction into the dogmas and presuppositions of that institution or community, even when it's fairly liberal. Philosophers don't say, stop talking to your friends or give us all your money. They don't have
Mm.
to exhibit the excesses of the most stereotypically exploitative cults in order for them to employ unwittingly some of the features that cults use to indoctrinate and enforce obedience. Some of them
Mm.
being like what you said. Most of the time, most people aren't having people go, "You're lying, you're lying, you're lying," but they'll go, "Oh, come on, you know, you
Mhm.
know." And this is the kind of reaction that anybody that's not immediately inclined to report having qualia will tend to get from people that believe in qualia, is uh, incredulity coupled with doubt. And so, if people don't accuse you of lying, they'll at least think you're confused or you haven't thought about it enough. Well, maybe if you reflect on it more, you'll see.
Mhm.
There is this social pressure to conform and comply and employ the standards. And I don't think it has to be nefarious. It doesn't have to be
Mm-mm.
malicious. It's just that people that have been induced into thinking this way, like once you have that pseudo eureka moment, right? Like a real eureka moment
Mm.
is genuine understanding. Pseudo eureka is, yeah, I do have the intuition. You have that sudden moment where you feel like you're part of the club now. Now,
Yeah, it's motivated. Yep.
right now, imagine imagine I wasn't like low agreeableness and screw you, I don't care what you think. Imagine I really wanted to be like I had two priorities in college: get things right and be liked by my peers. And imagine you dial up the liked by my peers and dial down the get things right. And now I'm in the class and I'm having people cajole me saying, come on, you got to have an intuition in this footbridge case. What's going to happen? All right, okay. So yeah,
Okay. Yeah.
I guess I got the intuition that I wouldn't push. Yeah, I guess I wouldn't. And what I might be responding to is my reluctance to push. I would be reluctant to push, or my prediction that I would not push in real life. So I latch onto that and go, I guess that's the intuition. That's what they're talking about. It's not what they're talking about. They're talking about the truth tinkle. They're talking about, I'm supposed to have an intellectual appearance that the proposition one ought not push the person off the footbridge in the footbridge scenario
Mhm.
is true. I'm just supposed to seem true. I'm not really experiencing that, but I could latch on to something close enough, report the intuition, and then imagine what would happen. I'm getting cajoled and pressured, and I go, yeah, okay, I guess immediately, yeah, there you go. Yeah, okay, we know what side you take, right?
Mhm.
Now I'm accepted. Social acceptance is predicated on conformity to the norms and expectations of the people there.
I could see that becoming a very almost like a predictive, maybe predictive isn't the right word, but okay, so think about that scenario where the person ends up, acquiescing kind of to social pressure to say like, yeah, okay, I do, okay, sure, I have this intuition. I would say that could actually really end up sort of supporting the idea of an intuition itself, because I think that, like, when we talk about things like agreeableness and people wanting to be liked and things like this, I think it depends on the culture probably, but oftentimes we don't like to think of ourselves that way. We like to think of ourselves as like, no, I like to follow what's true, and I don't kowtow to social pressure, even though we do. So you could then imagine someone who that's what happened when they were in college, but now it's 20 years later and they think about the social experiment. What are the odds that they're gonna sit there and go like, "Oh, yeah, I remember not really having a solid opinion, but then I remember my friends put pressure on me and then I kowtow." No, they're gonna be like, "Nope, I just knew. I always had," you know what I mean? Like,
Yes, I want to make a point about this. So I recently was just arguing with a random person on YouTube, that was like incredulous at my skepticism that philosophers can accurately report what their intuitions were. Now, no, the way that
Mm,
philosophers characterize intuitions is they often characterize them as these a pre-theoretical uh, tendency to have a non-inferential um, appearance of the truth of some proposition. That's a way that they might characterize them. Now, what's critical there is that, or they might say it's a spontaneous judgment that's made without reflection. Well, take the trolley problem. Let's just run with that example. A 50-year-old philosopher who's had a PhD for 20, 25 years, if you ask them, hey, what's your intuition on the trolley problem? They go, I would pull the switch, but not push the person in the footbridge. Um, they're not having a current
mm,
intuition because that would only happen if it was spontaneous. They've already discussed and reflected on this so much that they no longer have intuitions about the trolley problem. They don't. And because by their own definition, they couldn't be having an intuition, psychologically speaking. And again, the psychology here
mm,
matters because things like habituation
mm,
matter. But of course, let's set aside that psychologists just fucking ignore all of the psychology here. So they're not having an intuition. Okay. So what are they
mm,
reporting? They're reporting allegedly their memory about what their intuition was 30, 35 years ago. Now, what I was telling this person is that we are not reliable judges of our memories in certain kinds of domains and in certain situations. Now, my memory of what my name was yesterday or a year ago or when I was a child, yeah, I had the same name. There's no like I have a whole bunch of mutually corroborate. I could go find a document, right? There's a whole bunch of inductive and abductive reasons to think that my name did not change, and so my memory of what my name is pretty secure. My memory of how specific events went down. Some of the facts are going to be distorted. I've talked about several memories I've had. Um,
mm,
I actually remember the class when I was discussing the trolley problem. I believe I was one or two rows back in the left side of the room, and I remember the building it was in at the university I was at. But I might be wrong about that, right? I have this visual memory of where I was.
mhm,
Could be totally wrong. The bottom line
yeah,
is though that while memory is generally reliable, certain kinds of memories are not so reliable. There's empirical research in this. Here's one that people are not good at judging. When people change their political positions, they often insist that that's the political view they held all along. So
mm,
let's say it's 2020 and a person is a 60-year-old Democrat. So they're not young and they're a Democrat. And you ask them, do you support gay marriage? And they're like, of course I do. And you're like, did you support gay marriage in the 90s? Many of them would say, of course, I always supported it. Bullshit. Many of them straight up were opposed to it. Why?
mm,
Well, the dominant Democratic Party line then was still not in favor of gay marriage,
mm,
right? So those they're wrong, and or at least there's a good chance that they're wrong. And sometimes politicians have been called out, although of course they could be lying. But the bottom line is there is empirical research showing that when people's political positions change, they distort, they warp their memory to claim or to, not to claim. Their memory is distorted in such a way that they believe that their current views were the views that they always held. They actually report that. I don't see any particular reason to think that they're all lying about what their
no,
views
yeah,
were. And it makes sense why people would misremember in these cases because their current views that they hold are so central to their identity. And moral identity is one of the most central aspects of who we see ourselves as people. People have a motivation to distort their memory in order to believe that their current moral views were the views they always held. This is not the case for their view about like what kind of car they drove when they
mm,
were 20. There's no particular motivated reasoning to distort that. Oh, I drove a Ferrari. Come on, no, you didn't. So that's just not as plausible. And there's not really very good evidence to support it. The bottom line, though, is we have evidence is true. You track people, they voted in the 2012 election or whatever. You track them in 2020, you track them in 2024. See what they thought then, see what they think now, ask them what they thought then, and ask them how confident they are. They misreport
yeah.
what they thought then, and they're super confident about it. Boom,
I think
false
it could
memories.
be, yeah, I think it could be completely innocuous as well, even like even in principle. Like oftentimes maybe it isn't. Like I said, it could be like what I was saying, where oh, they were actually kind of pressured into it, but they don't like the idea of that. But I was thinking the other day as well of like it just could be like a lack of a memory really at all. Like you could even have somewhere it was like okay, a given topic that at some point they might have done like the most rigorous line of logical examination on what they think on this topic, but maybe it was kind of complicated. And now years later, you ask them about it, and what stuck with them is their conclusion. So
Oh,
now, but
yes.
they don't remember how they got there. So now they're experiencing it as an intuition. Oh, I just know this thing. Well, they don't just know it. They just don't remember the line of reasoning of how they came to the conclusion. It's not an intuition, it's a conclusion, but they're mislabeling it as an intuition.
Yeah, you're absolutely right about that. I'll see if this works with you. I like to ask people this. Who was the first president of the United States?
George Washington.
Yeah, where were you and when exactly did you learn that?
I mean, I could guess, but it would be a guess.
Right.
I'm
Yeah.
assuming first, but I don't remember. I don't remember the day. I have no idea.
Right, exactly. So, and part of what I'm drawing attention to is that we have different types of memory. So there's episodic memory, which is your memory of the specific narrative reconstruction of the events that have occurred in your life. And then there's semantic memory, your memory of like specific facts. Like if I say, you
Mm,
know, what's that tall mountain that everybody climbs in East Asia?
East Asia.
Lots of people die on it.
Everest.
Yep, Mount Everest. See,
Yeah.
so that's like semantic knowledge. You didn't. That's not. You're not reporting like last week I ate a sandwich. It's not like that.
Mhm.
There's different kinds of
Yeah.
memory, and semantic and episodic memory can come apart. You can know something, but you could forget the circumstances, period, or time in which you learned it. Likewise, you can learn things and then forget the precise inferential process, step, reflection, or experiences you had that
Mhm.
led to it. A person can go on a long walk, think for several hours, and go, you know what? I think deontologists are right. And they may forget that
Mhm.
they went through that whole process. And 20 years later, they're a deontologist and they report sincerely, I have deontological intuitions. And actually, there was a whole chain of inference they went through to get there, and they're not going to remember it. So, again, there's precedent in psychology that could allow philosophers to really re examine all these self reports about intuitions that they have that could cast a lot of what they take to be their reliable methods in very serious doubt. And it's bizarre and sad that they don't seem to care. I studied both fields, and it's impossible to overstate how valuable psychology is for doing philosophy well.
Mm.
And yet, philosophers treat it much of the time with contempt. Now, I do know that I've reported a lot of particularly negative experiences. I do want to caveat that these were typically exceptions. A lot of people like it. Most people don't care about you or think about you when you're in a university. So you're a student in class. Most of the people in the class don't give two shits about what you say, and they forget 5 seconds after they left the classroom. So most people don't care what I think. And a lot of people were supportive. I managed to drag people along to my side. I remember being in a particular seminar, and I think it was my last year at the university, and we were sitting around the class, and the teacher was asking everybody why they're there. And I think 3 different people said, "Oh, I'm here because of Lance and what he said, and he really convinced me." And when it got to the third person, the professor's like, "What the hell, Lance? What are you doing?" So I had this huge influence on all these people, and so a lot of people were sympathetic to what I said, what the sorts of things that I said, and even the course trajectory of some people's careers. At least one friend of mine, like his views shifted. I had an influence on him, and it caused him to change the direction of his career. And so he had a big influence on me too. So it was a two-way street. But like I had influence on people, but I did encounter people. Like for instance, I encountered a person. I'm not going to say who they were, but they basically said something like, "I don't even understand why you're in this program or at this university. I don't really think you belong here." And this was specifically because of my skepticism about intuitions and philosophical methods, my support for empirical methods. They basically were like, "I don't even know why you're here." And I've had students tell me, I think that you should leave because not out of like, I hate you and want you to leave, but like, this
Yeah.
isn't for you. It's like if
Yeah.
imagine I was going to seminary school and
Mm.
I'm like, I don't know if Catholicism is true. You could see why someone else would be like, then maybe you shouldn't
Yeah.
become a priest. Like it would
Yeah.
seem reasonable from
Mm.
that point of view. But there's like an established belief you're supposed to have. I thought philosophy wasn't like that. And yet
It
there was
shouldn't
the
be.
sense of like, yeah, accept our dogmas or maybe get the hell out of here.
Yeah, it's like how I mean, and that's my thing. I was thinking about it actually in the shower earlier today. It was like um you know, philosophy, everybody knows it. Technically it's like the love of wisdom, the philosophia. Um but it's like so yes, love of wisdom and you can get into what that means, but at the same time it's like to me the whole point of philosophy is like a curiosity to like examine what's true, examine how we think, why we think what we think, all these different kinds of things like like it's an examination. And so what at sort of the fundamental root of everything that we're talking about with some of these certain behaviors and stuff is what bothers me is how the it's my show. How the fuck are you going to say you're a philosopher or you love philosophy and yet constantly display just a fundamental level of fucking incuriosity? Like, obviously, the psychological aspect, like, brings a lot of that, but, like, I don't even think that you like, even if you weren't sort of in both domains like you are, even if you're just a pure philosophy person, even if you were sitting here listening to this conversation and be like, "Yeah, well, I'm more interested in the esoteric kind of thing," like, that's fine. You can do that, but you still have to be fundamentally curious, and I think that, like, a lot of what we're kind of talking about and maybe speaking against today is that, like, this attitude that seems to pervade certain parts of the discipline that just like I said, I cannot look at a lot of the stuff we've been talking about without just identifying it as just being fundamentally dogmatic and just incurious. And at that point, I'm like, why the fuck? Talk about why are you see? That's my thinking because you're saying you had that experience of people being like, I don't know if why you're here. Why the fuck are you doing philosophy if you're not a curious person? Like, what is it if you're not trying to understand different views and understand how we think and understand what's going like what are you doing? Like, that shouldn't even be what religion is, but like that pervades so much in certain parts of religion is this dogmatism. But if you're going to be a dogmatic philosopher, obviously it happens all the time. But to me, that's an oxymoron. What do you mean a dogmatic philosopher? That doesn't mean you don't
Let's
have
try.
your views and your opinions, but what are we doing here? How can you say you love wisdom but then be like we think like of wisdom and people think about Socrates of Socrates and people have their opinions about him, but it's like of saying like his great knowledge was knowing that he knew nothing, of like this idea of like this radical epistemic humility. Like, what we're talking about here is literally the farthest thing away from that you could possibly imagine. Of on one side you have Socrates, one of the OGs, the great, saying, "I know that I know nothing. I've looked at all these things and I understand my position as this creature that I am, that I know nothing." And on this other side we have, I'm obviously correct and I don't understand how anyone could disagree with me. Well, fuck off. Like, at that point I don't even think you're a bad philosopher. I don't even think you're a fucking philosopher.
Yeah, I mean that's a harsher indictment than even I think I'd be inclined to give, which I rarely meet anyone harsher than I am. It obliges me to try to steel man the perspective that they're coming from. And so think about it this way. Imagine you and I were studying to be biologists and we were like trying to
Mm,
study primates or whatever. And hey, let's go study the bonobos. Hey, let's go study the orangutans or whatever. And then somebody goes, look, I really want to study Bigfoot. Or maybe the proper way to study primate behavior is to put on a tinfoil hat and sit in our basements, right? You might be like, all right, look, I want to get some serious work done. That's
mm,
ridiculous. I'm not interested in doing that. Um, I could see where that person's coming from. I think if you haven't bothered to fully take the time to look at the alternative view, it could look from the outside like tinfoil hattery. And I think
mm,
this is how philosophers are seeing my approach and perhaps your approach
mm,
as as a view that is rejecting fundamental and established paradigms in such a
mm,
way where it gives the crackpot vibe or the you're not even trying to do what I'm doing vibe to where they're just like, look, I need some framework in which to explore my curiosity. I have that framework, and now I'm trying to explore and satisfy my curiosity within that circumscribed domain where I
mm,
have the paradigmatic groundwork and tools to explore what I want to explore. There's all these questions. I want to solve. I want to figure out what knowledge really is, or I want
yeah.
to solve the dispute between dualists and physicalists and idealists. So, and they have this whole history to draw on too. So there's this big debate, idealists and dualists and physicalists and all of them, and they want to get involved in that debate. So they see all these strains of thought where there's often more, 2,000 or more years, and they want to jump into that melee and get involved. And here you have someone like myself who's a quietist that would say that metaphysical dispute, a dispute about like the number of different kinds of fundamental things there are, is a total waste of time and a pointless argument.
Yeah.
I
Mhm.
could see why they would say, okay, so I'm trying to do a thing here, and you're saying I just shouldn't
Mhm.
even do that thing.
Mhm.
Maybe this isn't for you. I'm trying to do the thing, but
Mhm.
they're operating under the mistaken assumption that I'm saying you shouldn't do anything, like go play cards or
Mhm.
something. When I'm
Yeah.
actually saying, look, there are better ways of approaching questions about what reality is like
Mhm.
than trying to count the number of fundamental things. If you really want to
Yes.
address that
Yeah.
question, there's a better tool on the table. So I'm trying to be sympathetic, and maybe it's not convincing, or maybe it is, but I think from their state of mind that they're not being incurious. They are circumscribing their curiosity in an epistemically responsible way, in the same way you or I might not be receptive to somebody that wanted to take out like their ectoplasm detector so we could go look for ghosts. I wouldn't be
Yeah.
receptive to that. I actually, you know what? I probably would go with them, but I wouldn't believe it.
Yeah.
But I
Yeah.
would go along. Okay, fine. You find a
Yeah.
ghost? That show me a ghost. So
Yeah.
maybe they just wouldn't. And I think that is a difference. And I do think on some fundamental level they are less curious now that the way I'm thinking through. I'm trying to steel man them,
Mhm.
but like
Yeah.
if
Well, there's
someone
traps
appeared to
everywhere.
be, yeah, if someone had showed up and appeared to be sincere and serious and at least somewhat knowledgeable and said, Lance, everything about the way you're doing philosophy is totally wrong. Let me show you another way. And it initially sounded ridiculous. I think I would be intrigued and want to know more.
Mm.
So I think I'm the kind of person where if you show up with a tinfoil hat, I'll hear you out. And I think that they
Mhm.
won't. And I do think that
No.
there's a difference there.
Yeah.
But I do think that they
Yeah.
think that the difference is justified. If that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, my thing too is that like because I've talked before, I've realized I have to write a work about essentially like against phenomenal conservatism because I'm much more towards the skeptical side of thing. But once again, it's like I understand that there can. I'm not saying that there can't be a trap, say, in like and I'm not like a radical skeptic because there's you can take skepticism to a point where it's like well, you can't know anything, just give up, don't do anything, and that's not what I'm saying. Like my point is more of like an aspect of curiosity and having like a to me like an accurate understanding of sort of your own epistemic position. That doesn't mean that you can't do work. And my thing is on their side of things, I'm not saying, oh, fuck your framework, you don't use frameworks, anything like that. My thing is, yes, frameworks are necessary, tools are necessary, but they are things that we use to do work. And the trap that I think that they fall into is they begin to conflate their framework, whether it be in metaphysics or any of these other things, they conflate the framework that they are using to do intellectual work with. They conflate the framework with truth itself. And I find that exceptionally dangerous. So that
Yeah, I
there
think
is
that's
there a
right. Yeah.
danger? Yeah, is there a danger possible for radical skepticism? Yes, sure. But my thing is, unless someone is in the grip of the deepest, darkest depression, they probably won't fall into that track because we're tool using animals. We got to keep moving. We're gonna do shit. So I think based on my experience, it's far safer to have a default skeptical attitude and then operate from there to do what work you can while keeping your hand on that sort of fundamental skepticism. Because I think that the trap on their side is far more insidious and it is far more seductive. Because I'm fine with frameworks and they're fine with frameworks, but they're in a position where they are far more likely to get seduced by the solidity that framework author offers them and start to make a category error where they start confusing the fact that the framework is a tool for doing intellectual work and confusing that for the thing itself, and then that leads to dogmatism and stagnation and calcification and all those other things that I hate.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose my way of thinking about it would be, I think that we should be able to step out of the paradigms or approaches we use to doing philosophy and put different shoes on and be able to look at things from those different perspectives and see how they work. And I think we should be open to that. Um, I was trained in and taught to take this standard sort of mainstream analytic approach, and I never found it satisfying. It's not like I embraced it and then later abandoned it. I was never really satisfied with it. And then it took me years and years and years and running into a very knowledgeable pragmatist to say, look, on some level, you've been a nascent pragmatist the whole time. And that turned out to
Mm,
be true. And I was, all right,
yeah,
okay.
yeah,
And
yeah.
it really fit the disposition I had all along, like a glove. I mean, it was a very good
Mm,
fit. Um, so I've swam in those waters before, but then I find like the analytic waters before. And now I'm like a self-identified pragmatist, but the the disdain philosophers have for pragmatism is quite remarkable. I mean, I don't know if you've seen, Humor has a post where he makes a little swipe at pragmatism and moves on. It's often dismissed out of hand, and I also find that very unfortunate. But just there's something very disappointing about analytic philosophers just dismissing alternative paradigms or frameworks for doing
Hmm.
philosophy with what strikes me as very little substantive engagement with them.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, that's it. And because that's the thing is, I don't feel like when I talk to, because I have a few friends who I've talked to, who are much more on the analytic side of things. Like, I enjoy the conversations, and they're very challenging for me because I don't have that kind of background, and it doesn't map how my brain really works. Like, I didn't start out being like, I'm going to be a pragmatist, but once I learned about pragmatism and what that really meant, I was like, oh, okay, that's definitely how I sort of naturally operate. But I enjoy talking to analytical people sometimes because it really challenges me to think in a different way than I normally do. And I have to push myself to do it, because when I start reading an article and it's like, if subject S engages with P and reaches around and touches X's butthole, I'm just like, oh my god, like like that kind of language
Yeah,
immediately my brain like shorts out.
I
It's
have to
not
force
wrong. It's
myself
good for
through
some
that
things.
writing.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
not great.
And that's the thing though, is it's I think this, like, it's a little saying, like I said, but I come back to it, is like, there's traps everywhere. There's no system or way of being that, if used inappropriately in the wrong context, can't get you into fucking trouble. And that's true for pragmatism, and it's true for analytical philosophies. There's things that the analytical way of doing things is good at that isn't really in the wheelhouse of, and so that's why I'm such a big fan of, like, collaboration and trying to understand other views. It's like the illusionism thing. I'm not an illusionist. I wasn't convinced by it, but at least now I actually understand what the fuck it's actually saying,
Mhm.
and I'm not out there misrepresenting it and being a dickhead about it. So, you know,
Yeah, one thing you'll notice is that when people take the time to study a position, they rarely become dismissive, smug jerks about it. They will
yeah,
respect it while disagreeing with it.
yeah,
You mentioned new atheism. I am going to have to head out of here in a minute.
yeah.
But
I
like,
figured. Yeah,
I think that was one of the problems with the new atheism was a
yeah,
profound gleeful disrespect
hmm,
for not
yep.
just religion, but like philosophy of religion and the entire intellectual foundation on which it's
Theology,
based.
everything. Yep.
Now, yeah, I'm not a theist. I don't think the arguments are particularly good,
No.
but they're not. Now that I'm familiar with arguments for moral realism, it's made me look back on fondly on the stuff when I encounter arguments for theism. I'm like,
It could be
arguments for
worse.
theism are they're serious. There's ontological argument, the Kalam argument, the fine tuning. They've got a wide range of arguments that do touch on cosmology and like modality, and also there's like a lot to it. Now I think none of it works, but
Yeah.
it's at least worth taking comparative to the quality of arguments for realism, at least an order of magnitude more seriously, because most arguments for moral realism, there's very few exceptions. Like Hume's argument for moral convergence is an exception, but by and large, the arguments are in some or another way a veiled direct appeal to the reader's realist intuitions, which I don't have.
Mm,
So it's
yeah.
just not particularly good.
Yeah.
And theistic arguments are not quite so bad. They're not quite so.
Mm,
They're not mostly one note. They're not quite so easy to refute. And so that's given me more respect for theism. All right, I could see how
mm,
somebody could walk through these arguments and end up with a different perspective than me. Um,
mm,
so that's changed my attitude on it.
yeah.
Um,
That's what I'm
yeah.
doing now
So I
with
guess.
deontology. I'm in the middle of learning, because I had a really negative reaction to when I first learned about deontology, probably also because of my background. And once again, I realized, I'm
Hmm.
like, all right, I'm kind of being full of shit, and I'm learning about it, and I'm not about to become a deontologist. But like you said, I no longer feel, there's a version of it that I still very, very strongly disagree with. But there's a lot more subtlety and things there that I didn't know about, because I didn't know about them, and I made too quick of a judgment, just like I did with illusionism. So I'll probably be releasing an article called "I Was Wrong About Deontology," sort of.
Cool. Yeah, I look forward to seeing that. Yeah, just as a final general note is
Mhm.
I I think if you find yourself disposed to be scornful, mocking, and hostile towards a particular philosophical perspective, there's probably something going wrong with you. Now, I say probably. It might be that you would look at it and go, "No, this is pretty much deserving of ridicule." But
Sometimes
maybe
that's
it's
the
not.
case. Yeah.
Yeah, sometimes it is
Yeah.
the case, but sometimes it might not be. And um, yeah, I guess I would just hope that the sort of like dissident or non-mainstream philosophical perspectives I take can be treated with a little less contempt by at least popular philosophy popularizers online. I can't say, by the way, if you go to a conference or something, it's not like you just see people openly like bullying the pragmatist or something. I don't. Well,
Yeah.
at conferences, people get along just fine. So
Yeah.
at least part of the condescension, scorn, and ridicule we're seeing is just the fact that when you put people behind a keyboard, they become extra
Mm,
assholes, and in
yep.
person,
Yeah.
they just wouldn't be.
It's just an internet problem. Yeah. Across the board. Yeah. But well, thank you so much for doing this. This has been fantastic. I was super excited to get to talk to you.
Yeah, it was
And
a lot of fun.
yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah,
And thank you everybody that joined.
yep, and I'd be happy to talk again. I'm sure there's plenty more we could talk about. So I like this conversation because I kind of feel like we were just like shooting the shit, like just wherever it went. I like
Yeah.
these unstructured conversations.
Yeah, yeah. That's pretty much all I do. I've never done anything really formal, and I always call my things like a chat with so and so because also too, I know that you do more kind of structured things, and on that front, I've always felt that maybe some people who do kind of more structured stuff more often might just enjoy just kind of like just talking.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So
Cool. Well, thanks for
yeah,
having me. This is a lot of fun, and yeah, looking forward to talking again.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Lance, and thank you everybody who joined. I'll see you all later. Bye bye.